She walked into the emergency room on a Tuesday night with a slight limp and a coffee stain on her scrubs, and not a single person looked up. That was the thing about Mara Voss. She had spent 3 years making herself forgettable, and she had gotten very good at it. The nurses at Harlow Memorial Medical Center in Denton, Washington knew her as the quiet one. The one who showed up early, left late, never complained, and never explained herself. The younger residents thought she was slow. The senior doctors thought she was timid. Dr. Callum Reese, the hospital's most decorated trauma surgeon, had once told her in front of a full trauma bay to stop second-guessing people who actually knew what they were doing. She had nodded and gone back to work. Nobody asked why a woman with her obvious instincts was wearing scrubs instead of a white coat. Nobody wondered why her hands never shook, even when everyone else's did. Nobody thought to ask what she'd done before this, before Denton, before Harlow, before the limp that she never explained and nobody dared ask about. They were about to find out. Because in 4 hours, a military helicopter carrying wounded special operations soldiers was going to go down in the hills east of Denton, and the man pulled from the wreckage, bleeding, barely conscious, lungs filling with fluid, was going to open his eyes in the trauma bay, look past every doctor in the room, and say her name. Not the name on her badge. The other one. The one that had been classified for 7 years. Before you find out what happens, if this kind of story is what you've been looking for, hit that subscribe button right now. We put out cinematic stories like this every week, and you don't want to walk into the middle of one. Hit the like button if you're already hooked, and drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, back to Mara. The shift started the way all of Mara's shifts started, badly and all at once. 2 car accident victims came in from the interstate at 6:14 p.m. The first one, a middle-aged man named Garrett, had a broken collarbone and a gash across his forehead that bled impressively but wasn't life-threatening. The second was worse, a young woman, early 20s, unconscious on arrival, with a blood pressure that kept trying to bottom out. Mara had already started a second large-bore IV before the attending assigned to the case had finished reading the paramedics' handoff notes. A construction worker with a nail gun injury followed at 6:40. 3 nails in the left forearm, 1 dangerously close to the radial artery. The man himself pale and sweating and trying very hard to pretend he wasn't about to pass out. By 7 o'clock, the waiting room was backed up past the double doors. The triage nurse was doing the particular tight-lipped face of someone managing a situation that was slightly beyond managing, and someone had spilled a full bag of saline on the floor near Bay 3 and hadn't told anyone yet. Mara had already quietly cleaned it up. She moved through the chaos the way water moves through rock. Not around it, not above it, just steadily through. She started 2 IVs before the residents assigned to them had even finished reading the charts. She noticed the construction worker's oxygen saturation dropping before the monitor alarmed and adjusted the flow herself, then wrote a note in the chart that the attending would later read and assume he had caught himself. She restocked Bay 2's crash cart during a 2-minute gap between patients because she'd noticed 3 days ago that the evening crew had been leaving it short on epinephrine and nobody else had bothered to flag it. That was fine. That was the plan. Stay useful. Stay quiet. Don't become the story. Dr. Reese swept through the floor at 7:20 on his post-surgical rounds, still wearing his OR cap, still carrying the particular energy of a man who had just successfully done something difficult and wanted everyone nearby to be aware of it. He was 38, sharp in the way that came from talent reinforced by constant validation, and he ran his trauma floor the way some men ran everything, with the assumption that the room arranged itself around him. He wasn't cruel exactly. He was precise in his dismissals, which was almost worse. Voss? He barely looked at her. The Garfield kid in Bay 2, what's his GCS? 14, she said. He was combative when he came in, settled about 15 minutes ago. Pupils are equal and reactive. I've been watching the left one. There's a very slight lag that wasn't there an hour ago. Reese finally looked at her fully, and not in a good way. I asked for the GCS. The GCS is 14. I thought you should know about the pupil. When I need your clinical observations, Voss, I'll ask for them. That's not me being harsh. That's me telling you how the floor works. Understood. Good. He took the chart, scanned it, handed it back. Tell Dr. Malone I want to repeat neurocheck in 30. I'll let him know. He moved on. She heard him say something to one of the residents as he turned the corner. She didn't catch all of it, but she caught the tone, and she caught the word overstepping, and she filed it in the same place she filed everything she wasn't supposed to react to. Mara had a particular way of managing these moments. She didn't hold on to them, didn't replay them, didn't let them accumulate behind her sternum the way she'd watched happen to other nurses. The ones who eventually burned out or transferred or started crying in supply closets at the end of long shifts. She registered them the way you register weather. Noted, recorded, released. She had survived things that would have ended Dr. Callum Reese completely. A man who questioned her chart notes was not going to be the thing that broke her. At 8:12, she took her first break in 6 hours, standing in the break room with a vending machine sandwich she didn't particularly want and a cup of coffee she needed badly. The break room had a window that faced east, toward the hills above Denton, and she stood at it while she ate and watched the sky. There was weather building out there. She could feel the pressure drop before she could see it, the way the air changed, the way the distant ridgeline had gone slightly hazy in the last hour. She had learned to read atmospheric shifts in environments where predicting weather wasn't a comfort measure, but a tactical one, where the difference between a front moving in and a front holding off could determine whether a helicopter could extract wounded men or whether those men spent another night bleeding in the field. She finished the sandwich, drank the coffee, went back to work. At 8:45, she caught the pupil change she'd flagged earlier. The left was definitely lagging now. Not dramatically, nothing that would alarm a casual observer, but enough. She found Malone, the resident Reese had assigned to the case, and told him directly. Malone, to his credit, ordered the CT immediately. The scan showed a small subdural hematoma. Early stage, catchable. The kind of thing that became a very different conversation if it wasn't caught for another few hours. The patient went to neurosurgery. Nobody connected it back to the flag Mara had raised an hour earlier. That was fine. That was always fine. But the mass casualty call came in at 9:47 p.m. She was in the supply room restocking a crash cart when the overhead tone fired. 3 pulses, the specific pattern that meant incoming multiple. And the charge nurse's voice came immediately after, controlled in the way that charge nurses trained themselves to be when everything was about to escalate sharply. All available trauma staff to the main ER bay. Military transport incoming. Multiple casualties from a helicopter incident. ETA approximately 10 minutes. All available trauma staff. Mara closed the crash cart, confirmed it was fully stocked, and pushed it out ahead of her. The floor shifted into its crisis configuration. The organized scramble that looked chaotic from the outside, but had an internal logic to it. People moving to assigned positions. Equipment being pulled to ready positions. Voices clipped and functional. Reese appeared from somewhere, coat gone, already gloved. 2 other attendings converged on the main bay. Residents moved. The charge nurse directed traffic from the hub with the particular authority of someone who had run this drill enough times to do it without thinking. Mara moved to Bay 1, the largest trauma bay, and began preparing without being asked or assigned. She checked the airway cart, confirmed blood products had been ordered, checked that the rapid infuser was primed, looked at the defibrillator to make sure it hadn't been left on standby from the last use. She noted which residents were working the floor tonight, 3 third-years and a second-year who had only been on trauma rotation for 2 weeks. Competent, most of them, under standard conditions. What was incoming was not going to be standard conditions. Voss? Reese appeared at her elbow. Bay 3. She looked at him steadily. Bay 3 is for stable patients. Yes. He said it with the pleasantness he deployed when he wanted to make it clear that the conversation was already over. Bay 1 is for the attending team and senior residents. Bay 3 needs coverage. Rodriguez is free. He can cover Bay 3. Rodriguez is with me tonight. You'll be in Bay 3 with Park. Park was a nurse tech. Bay 3 on a mass casualty call was the parking spot. The place you put people you didn't want in the way. She knew it, and he knew it. And the 2 seconds of eye contact between them confirmed that both of them knew the other one knew. She went to Bay 3. She did it because fighting the assignment in the middle of an incoming mass casualty was not the right call, and because she had learned in contexts considerably more serious than this one that the moment to choose your battles was before you needed to fight them, not during. She went to Bay 3, and she set it up properly, and she stood with Rodriguez, not Park. Rodriguez had come after all. The assignment had apparently changed, and she listened, The first two soldiers came in at 9:58. Lacerations, one fractured tibia, one dislocated shoulder with secondary soft tissue damage. Painful, significant, manageable. She heard the assessments from across the floor, tracked the information automatically, running her own parallel picture that nobody had authorized her to run. The third soldier changed the register of the night. She couldn't see him clearly from Bay 3. She caught fragments. The body language of the paramedics, the rate at which the gurney moved, the way the attending who intercepted it immediately turned toward the medication cart instead of the assessment area. She heard the saturation called out. 91, then 89. She heard Reese's voice cut through. "Get imaging on deck. I want a chest film before we—" She was already moving, not running. You didn't run in a trauma bay, but she moved at the particular speed she'd learned to move. Urgency without recklessness. The speed that got you there without creating a secondary problem. And she was at the entrance to Bay 1 before Rodriguez had processed that she'd left. The soldier on the gurney was young, late 20s. The kind of physical conditioning that came from years of training that went beyond standard military fitness. The leanness, the particular density of someone who had been pushed and had pushed back for a very long time. His left side had taken significant impact. His skin color was wrong in the specific way that meant his circulatory system was making decisions under pressure. His breathing had a sound to it. One of the residents was moving through the primary survey checklist, methodical and correct, the kind of correct that worked perfectly in 90% of situations. Mara looked at his chest, then at the monitor, then, very specifically, at his trachea. It was deviated. Subtly, the kind of subtle that you missed if you were working from a checklist and not from pattern recognition, but it was there. "Tension pneumothorax," she said. The resident looked up from his assessment. "We're still in the primary survey. We don't have imaging." The trachea is deviated left. His SAT is at 87. She was already at the procedure cart. "Imaging is going to take 4 minutes to set up and another 3 to read. He doesn't have 7 minutes. Voss. Reese's voice, from right behind her, carrying the particular frequency he used when he'd made a decision and considered it final. "Step back and let the team work." She turned and looked at him directly across the width of the gurney. His neck veins are distended. His trachea is deviated. His pressure is 60/40. You can call it yourself, but call it in the next 60 seconds. The room had gone very quiet. Not the silence of people stopped. The silence of people who kept working but had redirected some processing power to the space between two people who were not backing down. Reese held her gaze. She held his. And she watched the moment. She had seen this moment before, in other rooms, with other people. When training overrode ego. When a good doctor remembered that being right mattered more than being the one who was right. It didn't happen with everyone. It happened with Reese, and it happened in about 3 seconds. And she felt something in her chest release a fraction. "Needle decompression," Reese said. "Now, 14 gauge, second intercostal, right here." She had it ready. He took it from her without looking at her face, found his landmark, and went in. The sound of air escaping under pressure was immediate. The monitor's alarm pitch shifted within 30 seconds. The saturation number began to climb, 88, 90, 92. The resident exhaled audibly. Reese moved into the next phase of assessment without pausing. The room reorganized around the new information and kept moving. Reese did not acknowledge her. He turned to the resident and began explaining what the clinical presentation had looked like, the landmarks to watch for, the differential process, as though he'd caught it himself, as though the moment of redirection hadn't happened. Mara took 2 steps back. She let him have it. She understood the economy of these rooms, had understood it for years before this hospital, before this city. The credit was not the point. The point was the saturation number, currently at 94 and still climbing, and the young soldier on the gurney whose chest was now doing what chests were supposed to do. She went back to Bay 3. Rodriguez looked at her with an expression she recognized, the particular look of someone who had just watched something happen and wasn't sure yet what to do with what they'd seen. "Don't," she said, not unkindly. He nodded and went back to his chart. The floor stretched thin over the next hour, in the way it always did when a mass casualty event ran longer than the initial resource assessment had accounted for. The 4th soldier required emergency abdominal surgery, significant internal bleeding, straight to the OR without delay. The 5th came in with a traumatic brain injury serious enough that it required neurology. And the neuro attending on call was stuck in traffic on the highway coming in from Millvale, 22 minutes out. Mara worked the gaps. This was what she did, had always done, in every context she'd ever operated in. The official work, and then the invisible layer under it. The adjustments and catches and quiet course corrections that happened in the spaces between assigned responsibilities and never made it into any record. She adjusted a medication rate on the third soldier that the resident had calculated slightly wrong. She repositioned the fifth soldier's neck alignment when the transport brace was placed at an angle that would have compressed a vessel, doing it gently and quickly while two nurses were occupied with IV access, moving on before anyone looked up. 3 times in the space of an hour, something got better because of something she did. None of it was in any chart. By 10:50, the acute phase had stabilized. The floor was still busy. It was always still busy. But the specific elevated pitch of a mass casualty event had begun to flatten. People were breathing at a normal rate again. The charge nurse had unclenched her jaw. Reese was on the phone in the corridor, probably updating the surgical team on the abdominal case. Mara sat at the nurse's station and updated charts and told herself the worst of it was over. The second helicopter changed that. She heard it before she consciously recognized what she was hearing, the sound filtering through the building's walls in a way that was different from the medical transport helicopters she'd heard all evening. Different rotor sound, different engine note, the specific frequency of military aviation, which she had spent enough time around to have it embedded somewhere below deliberate thought. She stood up. The charge nurse was already on the radio, and the words coming through confirmed what Mara's nervous system had already registered. Harlow Memorial, this is Washington Military Air Transport. We have 1 additional incoming, adult male, multiple fragmentation wounds, respiratory compromise, command level officer, currently stable but deteriorating, ETA 6 minutes. Command level officer. The phrase landed in a specific place in Mara's chest and sat there. She told herself it was nothing. Told herself command level officers got hurt the same as everyone else, and Denton was close enough to the training corridors in the eastern hills that military casualties weren't extraordinary. She told herself the thing moving through her chest was fatigue and adrenaline residue and the particular edge of shift sensitivity that came from 8 hours of sustained focus. She went to the window. The helicopter set down on the rooftop pad at 11:22 p.m. with the particular precision of military pilots who landed under worse conditions than this before breakfast. The transport team had the gurney and the elevator in under 2 minutes. Mara heard the elevator moving. She went to Bay 1. She didn't think about the decision. She was simply in Bay 3, and then she was in the corridor, and then she was positioned near the entrance to Bay 1 with a particular quality of stillness that she used when she needed to observe without being observed. A stillness she'd spent years developing, which had kept her invisible in circumstances considerably more dangerous than a hospital floor. Reese was already there. 2 residents. The charge nurse. The standard configuration for a serious incoming trauma. The elevator doors opened. The gurney came through at speed, and Mara had a fractured half-second to take in the picture. The blood-soaked field dressing on the left shoulder, the secondary wound on the right flank with packing. She could already tell was inadequate for what was underneath, the oxygen mask, the vitals being called out by the flight medic in the clipped cadence of someone who had been managing a deteriorating situation for 20 minutes and was ready to hand it off. She ran the clinical picture automatically. Shoulder bleed controlled but significant. Flank wound uncertain. Pressure low and dropping in the specific pattern that meant the hemorrhage wasn't where the dressing was. Respiratory rate elevated. Then she looked at his face. The room did not stop. The monitors kept their rhythm. The nurses kept moving. Reese began his rapid assessment, and the residents moved to their positions, and the flight medic was talking, and the overhead lights were exactly what they'd been 3 seconds ago. But something in Mara Voss went completely, absolutely still. She knew him. Colonel James Warwick. She would have known him in worse light than this, with a worse injury than this, 7 years older than the last time she'd seen him. The jaw. The particular set of the shoulders, even unconscious on a gurney. The way some people were so entirely and completely themselves that even their body's automatic responses carried their signature. She had last seen James Warwick on a military airfield in a country she was not allowed to name. She had last seen him the night before her records were deleted. She was aware of her own breathing, steady. She made it stay steady. He was unconscious. She had time. She told herself she had time. She told herself the smart move was to step back, Find a shadow. Let Reese handle it. Let this night finish without her name entering any conversation that James Warwick was going to be part of when he woke up. She did not step back. She looked at the pressure numbers on the monitor, 68/41, dropping. And she looked at the field packing on the right flank. And she looked at the angle of the wound and the saturation trajectory, and the combination of those three things told her something clear and specific and urgent. The flank wound is bleeding internally, she said. The packing is managing surface loss. There's something deeper. Reese glanced at her with the expression he kept specifically for her. Voss? His pressure is dropping too fast for a controlled shoulder bleed. She moved to the right side of the gurney. The flank wound has a trajectory that could reach the inferior vena cava. His MAP is 61 and the trend is down. I can see the monitor, Voss. Then you can see he's got maybe 8 minutes before this becomes an OR emergency we're not prepared for. She met his eyes. Ultrasound. Right now. Peritoneal. 2 seconds. 3. Reese looked at the patient, at the monitor, at the wound site. Ultrasound, he said. Now. Fast protocol. The ultrasound showed free fluid. Significant, unmistakable. The dark pooling on the screen that meant blood where blood was not supposed to be. Internal hemorrhage missed in the field because the shoulder wound was larger and louder and had drawn every eye. Reese was already calling the OR. Warwick was moving within 6 minutes. Mara stood in the emptied bay after the gurney cleared and listened to the floor settle back into its ordinary rhythms, and she was aware of Reese somewhere at the edge of her vision, standing still in a way he didn't usually stand, looking at her with an expression she didn't try to interpret. He didn't speak. She didn't speak. She turned and walked back to the nurse's station, and she sat down, and she picked up the chart she'd been working on before the helicopter sound had changed everything, and she looked at the words on the screen without reading them. James Warwick was 3 floors above her in an OR. James Warwick, who had been in the room when she filed her report, who had been standing at the end of the table when the decision was made, she had never been sure about this part, had spent 7 years being not sure about this part, either tried to stop what happened to her or chosen not to. She didn't know which. She had lived inside that not knowing for 7 years, had built her entire quiet life in Denton inside the space of it. When he woke up, the not knowing was going to have to end. The clock above the nurse's station read 11:58 p.m. The floor hummed with its ordinary late-night frequency. Somewhere a monitor alarmed softly and was answered. Somewhere a resident was writing a note. Somewhere a patient was sleeping. Mara Voss sat very still at the nurse's station, and she looked like a woman doing her paperwork, and she felt the particular sensation of standing at the edge of something. Not a cliff, not a door, but something that had been waiting in the dark for a very long time, that had just heard her name, and it was starting to turn around. And it was starting to turn around. The night shift at Harlow Memorial had a specific texture to it after midnight, quieter but not quiet, the way a body was quieter under sedation but still working, still moving blood through all its systems, still doing the invisible labor that kept everything from stopping. The overhead lights dimmed slightly on a timer at midnight, a concession to the patients on the floor above who were trying to sleep. The ER stayed lit. It always stayed lit. Mara did not go home at the end of her shift. She told herself it was because the floor was still short-staffed, which was true. 2 nurses from the evening team had called out, and the overnight crew was running thin. She told herself Rodriguez needed backup, and that the 3rd soldier from the helicopter incident was showing some elevated temperature readings that warranted monitoring. Both of those things were also true. She did not examine the 3rd reason, which was that she was not capable of driving to her apartment and lying in the dark while James Warwick was 3 floors above her in post-op recovery, coming back to consciousness in a room full of people who didn't know who he was talking about when he eventually said her name. And he would say her name. She had no doubt about that. The only question was the context. She restocked supplies. She checked on the soldiers in bays 1 and 2, both stable now, both sleeping with the particular heaviness of people whose bodies had been through serious violence and were doing aggressive repair work. The young one, the one with the tension pneumothorax, had his color back. She stood in the doorway of his bay for a moment and looked at the rise and fall of his chest, easy and regular, and felt the particular quality of satisfaction that she had never managed to explain to anyone who hadn't done the same work. Not pride. It wasn't pride. It was more like completion. like a calculation that had been running in the background finally resolving. She went back to the nurse's station and drank bad coffee and filled out the rest of her charting. At 1:15 a.m., the charge nurse, a solid woman named Bev Okafor, who had worked this floor for 11 years and missed very little, appeared beside Mara with a look that wasn't quite suspicious, but was adjacent to it. "Your shift ended 40 minutes ago," Bev said. "I know. You're not on overtime authorization." "I know that too." Bev looked at her for a moment, not unkindly. "The colonel from the second helicopter is out of surgery. Recovery, 3rd floor. Stable." Mara did not change her expression. "Good. The attending up there says he's been asking for someone." Bev paused. "Keep saying a name. They're not sure if it's the anesthesia or—" "What name?" Mara asked, and her voice came out very level, which cost her something. Bev looked at her with the eyes of a woman who had spent 11 years watching people try to hide things in hospital corridors. They couldn't make it out clearly. Something with a V. She let that sit for exactly 1 second. "Go home, Mara. Get some sleep." Mara nodded. She gathered her bag. She walked toward the exit, and she made it as far as the ambulance bay before she stopped and stood in the cold air outside and looked up at the 3rd floor windows. She stood there for 3 minutes. Then she went back inside and took the elevator to the 3rd floor. The recovery ward at night had a different quality than the ER. Slower, more deliberate, the sounds of machines doing long-term work rather than crisis work. The nurses up here moved at half the speed of the trauma floor, but with just as much precision. It was a different skill set. Mara had always respected it. She knew the nurse on duty at the 3rd floor station, a tall, tired-looking man named Price, who had done a rotation in the ER 2 years back, and had occasionally asked her questions that suggested he paid attention to the answers. "I'm checking on a patient," she said. "Room 312, the colonel." Price looked at her badge, then at her face, with the look of someone making a decision about how much to ask. "He's been in and out since they brought him up. Anesthesia haze. He's been agitated." "Anyone with him?" "His unit sent a liaison officer. She's been in the waiting area, came up with the 2nd transport." Price hesitated. "He's been saying a name, same word over and over. The liaison officer said she doesn't recognize it." Mara kept her face neutral. "What word?" "Sounded like Voss. Or possibly Ross. Hard to tell when someone's coming out of general." He looked at her badge again, at the name printed on it. "You're Voss, right? Mara Voss, ER floor?" "Yes." "Huh." He said it without inflection, which was its own kind of answer. "Room's on the left. Liaison officer is Martinez. She's decent. Just heads up that she's going to have questions." "Thanks, Price." She walked down the corridor. Room 312 had its door half open, which was standard for monitored recovery patients. The light inside was low, one overhead panel on the dimmest setting, the blue glow of the monitoring equipment providing most of the illumination. Mara stood in the doorway and looked at James Warwick for the first time without the chaos of a trauma bay around her. He looked older. She hadn't registered that clearly downstairs, in the speed of the emergency. He was 46 now, and the years had done what years did. The face thinner, the lines deeper, particularly around the eyes and the corners of the mouth. His left shoulder was heavily bandaged. The right flank dressing was clean, which meant the surgical repair had held. His color was reasonable for someone 6 hours out of emergency surgery. His eyes were open. They were looking directly at her. Mara did not move from the doorway. Warwick's mouth moved. What came out was rough from the intubation tube, abraded and low, but she heard it clearly. "I thought you were dead," he said. She stepped into the room and let the door fall mostly closed behind her. "I thought about it," she said, and she meant it to come out with more distance than it did. "How are you feeling?" "Like someone packed my shoulder with gravel." He tried to shift and made a sound that was not quite a curse. "Sit down, Mara. You look like you're about to run." "I'm not going to run." "You ran last time." "Last time the situation was different." She sat in the chair beside the bed, on the right side, away from the shoulder injury. "You should rest. You've been out of surgery for 6 hours, and you're going to feel worse before you feel better." "Don't do that." "Do what?" "The nurse thing. The professional distance thing." His eyes were clearer now than they'd been in the trauma bay. The anesthesia was metabolizing, reality sharpening. "I've been looking for you for 2 years. Something moved in Mara's chest that she didn't have a name for. "You didn't look very hard." I looked as hard as I could without flagging that I was looking. His jaw tightened. When you go looking for someone who was officially erased, and you're in a command position, you do it carefully or you end up erased too. The monitoring equipment hummed. Somewhere down the corridor, a different machine ran its cycle. What happened out there tonight? She asked. The crash. Equipment failure. Or what they're going to call equipment failure. He paused, and she heard something in the pause that she recognized from years of learning to hear the things people put in pauses. I've been building a case, Mara, for 2 years. On what happened to you. On what happened to the unit. On what Hartfield and his people did. His voice dropped slightly. I needed your testimony. I needed your records. My records don't exist. Your records don't exist in the places they erased them. His eyes held hers. I found copies. Not all of them, but enough. The air in the room shifted. Mara sat very still. She had spent 3 years in Denton, Washington, building a life inside the assumption that everything she'd been was gone, that the records were gone, the testimony was gone. The paper trail that could connect the dead ends to the people who had created them was gone. She had built her silence on top of that assumption the way you built a structure on bedrock, because the alternative, the possibility that the bedrock wasn't as solid as she thought, was not something she had been able to afford to consider. How much? She asked. Enough. He held her gaze. I need you to come back, Mara. Colonel? James. He said it with the firmness of someone who'd made a decision about something. We stopped being formal 7 years ago, even if we didn't stop being complicated. She looked at him, at the IV line in his right arm, at the bandaging on his shoulder, at the face that was older than she'd last seen it and more tired and still, despite everything, carrying the particular quality of a man who had not given up on a thing he believed in. I'm a nurse in Denton, she said. That's what I am now. That's what you've been doing, he said. It's not what you are. And you know the difference. Before she could answer, the door opened. The woman who came in was in her mid-30s, military bearing obvious even in civilian clothes. The posture, the way she scanned the room in the first half second, the particular economy of movement. She had the look of someone who had been awake for a very long time and had decided that wasn't going to stop her from functioning. Colonel Warwick. Her voice was professional, neutral. The medical team asked me to let them know when you were fully alert. Her eyes moved to Mara and stopped there with the specific quality of attention Mara recognized from people who'd been trained to notice things. This is Captain Delara Martinez, Warwick said, my liaison officer. Nurse Voss, Mara said, ER floor. Martinez looked at her for one more second, then was casual. You were in the ER when they brought the colonel in? Yes. Price downstairs told me the colonel was asking for someone with your name while he was coming out of anesthesia. It wasn't quite an accusation. It wasn't quite not one either. People say a lot of things coming out of general anesthesia, Mara said. It doesn't usually mean much. Martinez looked at Warwick. Warwick looked at Mara with an expression that said, clearly and without speaking, that he was going to let her manage this the way she chose to manage it, and that he had his own opinions about her choice, and that they could discuss those opinions later. I should let him rest, Mara said, standing. Captain, Colonel? She looked at Warwick one last time. Get some sleep. She left the room and walked back to the elevator and stood in it while it descended and told herself that the conversation had accomplished nothing, that she had committed to nothing, that she was still Mara Voss of Harlow Memorial ER, and nothing about tonight required her to be anyone else. She almost believed it. The morning came in the way Denton mornings came in November, gray, slow, the light filtering through cloud cover that looked like it had been there for weeks and intended to stay. Mara drove home at 2:30 a.m., slept 4 hours, and came back for her regular day shift at 7 a.m. because she was scheduled and because staying home would have required her to explain why, and she was not capable of explaining why. The day shift started quietly. Post-mass casualty. The floor had a particular exhausted steadiness to it. The crisis was processed, the acute work was done, and what remained was the slower work of monitoring and maintenance, and the paperwork that always accumulated in the aftermath of a busy night. The soldiers who were still in-house were stable. The one from Bay 1, the tension pneumothorax whose name she'd learned from the chart was Private Owen Talley, 23 years old, from a small town in Idaho, was awake and coherent and apparently had a lot of opinions about the hospital food. Mara checked his vitals at 9:12 a.m. He watched her work with the particular focused attention of a young person who didn't have much else to do. "You were in the ER last night," he said, "when I came in." "I was. I heard what happened. One of the other nurses told me this morning." He paused. "She said a doctor caught a tension pneumo." Mara wrote the number on her chart. "Your pressure's good. Breath sounds are clear." "She said it was a nurse, actually, not the doctor." He was watching her face. "That the nurse told the doctor what it was." "You should focus on your recovery, Private Tally. I'm just saying." He looked at her with the directness of someone young enough to not yet have learned the full social cost of directness. "Whoever it was, I'd like to know, because I'd like to say thank you." Mara capped her pen. She looked at him for a moment, 23 years old, from Idaho, breathing easily in a hospital bed because of a pressure needle in 45 seconds. "You don't need to say thank you," she said. "That's what the shift is for." She moved on to the next patient. At 10:30, Dr. Reese found her in the medication room. She heard him come in and did not turn around immediately, giving herself the 2 seconds to arrange her face into the expression she wore for interactions with him. Neutral, professional, unreactive. "Voss." "Dr. Reese." "The colonel upstairs. Warwick." He stopped. She turned. His expression was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. Uncertain, which on Callum Reese looked almost foreign. "The liaison officer came to me this morning, Captain Martinez. She said the colonel has been asking about you specifically." Mara said nothing. "Not just your name," Reese continued. "She said he's been asking questions about your history, when you started here, where you were before." He looked at her directly. "I told her I didn't have that information." "Which is true. You don't talk about where you were before." "No. 3 years, and I don't know a single thing about your background before Harlow. I know your nursing certifications. I know your shift record." He paused. "I know you caught a tension pneumo last night that I was about to miss." The medication room was small. The space between them wasn't. "You didn't miss it," she said. "I was heading that direction." Something moved in his expression that wasn't quite an apology. Not quite, but was in the neighborhood of one, which for Callum Reese was probably a significant distance traveled. "What are you not telling me?" "That's a broad question. Narrow it to whatever is relevant to a military colonel waking up from surgery and asking for a nurse by name." Mara looked at him. She weighed the calculation. How much, how honest, what it would cost her either way. The same way she'd been weighing it since she walked into room 312 at 1:30 in the morning. "We've met before," she said. "A long time ago. In a different context." "Military context?" She said nothing. Reese absorbed that. "You were in the military." "I was." "You left." "I didn't leave," she said, and she hadn't intended to say it with that particular flatness, but it came out that way, and she couldn't take it back. "I was removed." The silence in the medication room had a different quality after that. Reese opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "Voss?" Her pager went off. They both looked at it simultaneously, and then at each other, and Mara felt the surreal quality of the moment. The conversation that had just cracked open something she'd kept sealed for 3 years, interrupted by a medical alert in the exact way important conversations always got interrupted in hospitals. She looked at the code. Her stomach went cold. 3rd floor, room 312. She was already moving. Warwick's cardiac monitor had thrown a warning. The night team had flagged an arrhythmia developing over the past 40 minutes that had finally triggered the alert. It wasn't immediately life-threatening, but post-surgical arrhythmia in a patient with his injury profile and blood loss was not something anyone was going to sit on. The 3rd floor charge nurse had paged the attending and the cardiology resident and had, apparently, also paged the ER floor as a general notification because the patient's file had a flag on it that Mara didn't recognize and couldn't account for. She arrived in room 312 30 seconds ahead of the cardiology resident. Warwick was awake, sitting up too much. She could see immediately that he'd been trying to get out of bed, or at least to a more upright position than the night team had left him in, and the movement had probably contributed to the arrhythmia. "Colonel?" She moved to the bed. "Lie back." You need to lie back. Your heart is doing something it shouldn't, and you sitting up at 60 degrees is not helping." She had her hands on his right shoulder, firm, guiding. Now, please. He lay back, not without resistance, but he lay back. Martinez was in the corner of the room, and she was on a phone call that she appeared to be trying to end while watching what was happening with Warwick simultaneously, and she was not succeeding at doing either thing well, which told Mara the phone call was important. The cardiology resident, a young woman named Dr. Sable, efficient and clearly sleep-deprived, came in and began her assessment, and Mara stepped back and let her work, monitoring the exchange, tracking the vitals on the screen. The arrhythmia was responding, not resolved, but settling. Sable adjusted the medication protocol, made a note, said something to the nurse who'd come in behind her. Martinez ended her phone call. The expression on her face was the kind of expression Mara had seen on people delivering news they'd been waiting to deliver for a long time, and it stopped her. That was Washington, Martinez said. She wasn't addressing Warwick specifically. She was addressing the room. The investigation into last night's helicopter incident has been fast-tracked. They're calling it a suspected mechanical failure, but there's a secondary review open. Her eyes moved to Warwick's. They're also formally opening a review of the Hartfield operation, based on documentation submitted 6 weeks ago. The room held very still. Mara heard the monitoring equipment. She heard the distant sound of the hospital corridor outside. She heard her own breathing, which was steady, which she was making stay steady. "What documentation?" she said. Martinez looked at her. "What documentation was submitted 6 weeks ago?" Mara said again, more carefully. "That's classified." "Captain." Warwick's voice, rough but clear. "Tell her." Martinez held Mara's gaze for a long moment, doing the calculation that military people did when a superior officer told them to breach a protocol they'd been trained to maintain. Then she said, "Testimony and supporting materials from 6 former unit members. About Operation Caldera. About what happened to the unit's medical specialist." She paused. "About why her records were removed." Mara stood in the room and felt something she had not felt in 3 years. Not relief. It was too early and too fragile, and too many things could still go wrong for it to be relief. Not anger, though the anger was there, had always been there, a low, steady heat she'd carried in her chest through 3 years of night shifts and bad coffee and people who didn't know her name. It was something more like the feeling of a room-changing pressure, the specific physical sensation of an enclosed space opening. "Who else knows?" she asked. "The review team, the JAG officers assigned to the case." Martinez looked at her steadily. "And as of about 4 minutes ago, the 2 senior officials who signed the order removing your records. They've been contacted by the review board." "Contacted," Mara repeated. "Formally notified that their documentation is under review." Martinez's expression didn't change. "They know someone gave testimony. They don't know who, specifically, because the submitted materials kept the identifying details restricted pending the review outcome." Mara looked at Warwick. Warwick looked back at her with the expression of a man who had spent 2 years building toward a moment and was now watching it arrive and finding it was more complicated than building toward it had been. "They're going to figure it out," Mara said. "Yes," he said. "They're going to figure out I'm in Denton." "That's probably already happening." She absorbed that. The monitoring equipment ran its cycle. Dr. Sable was still in the room, writing something in the chart with the careful attention of a person who was pretending not to listen. "How long?" Mara asked. "Before they make contact?" 24 hours. Maybe less." Warwick's jaw was set. "Which is why I need you to understand. The review is real, Mara. The documentation is solid. The JAG team is not going to let this get buried a second time. It got buried the first time by people who were very good at burying things. The people who buried it the first time are the ones under review." His voice hardened slightly. "They don't get to run the process this time." She wanted to believe him. She was aware of wanting to believe him. And she was aware of the distance between wanting and certainty. And she was aware that the last time she had trusted in a process, in official channels, in the idea that the right thing would happen because it was the right thing, she had ended up in Denton, Washington with a new name on her badge and 3 years of careful silence. She turned toward the door. "Voss?" Warwick's voice. She stopped. "I need to know if you'll cooperate with the review board." He said it plainly, without pressure, which was somehow worse than pressure. "Formally. On record. Your testimony is what closes this." She stood with her back to the room. Through the window at the end of the corridor, she could see the hills east of Denton. The same hills she'd looked at last night from the break room, where the storm had been building. It had rained while she slept. The hills were dark with it, the tree line heavy and wet. "I'll think about it," she said. She walked out into the corridor. She made it to the elevator and pressed the button and stood waiting, and her hands were in her pockets, and from the outside she looked like a nurse returning to her floor after a patient check. Professional, calm, unremarkable. What she was doing inside was a different calculation entirely. If the review was real, and Warwick believed it was real, and she believed that Warwick believed it, then the documentation existed, and the official mechanism existed, and the people responsible were already being notified that someone had found the loose thread they'd left hanging. And if those people were already being notified, if the clock was already running, then the question of whether she cooperated with the review board was only the second most urgent question. The first most urgent question was what those people were going to do about her before the review board got to them. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. The doors were closing when she heard it. A voice from somewhere down the corridor behind her, male, unfamiliar, carrying the specific calibration of someone who was trying to sound casual in a hospital hallway and did not quite have the right texture for it. "Excuse me, does anyone know where I can find a nurse named Voss, Mara Voss?" The elevator doors closed. Mara stood in the descending elevator and looked at her reflection in the brushed steel of the door. And the face looking back at her was calm and controlled, and 3 years practiced at being invisible. But the person who had just been described to a stranger in a corridor outside James Warwick's room was not invisible anymore. And the stranger asking the question had not come from the hospital's front desk. He had come from outside. She was sure of it in the way she was sure of things that her nervous system registered before her mind caught up. The cadence of his voice, the particular phrasing of the question, the way he'd said her name, both names, full name, with the precision of someone reading from a document rather than remembering from an introduction. The elevator hit the ground floor. The doors opened. Mara Voss stepped out into the lobby of Harlow Memorial Medical Center, and she walked at a normal pace toward the ER floor, and she was thinking very fast and very clearly in the way she had learned to think when situations moved faster than plans. 3 years. She had had 3 years of quiet, and now she had, if Warwick was right, maybe 24 hours before this became something she couldn't manage with silence and careful positioning and the art of making herself forgettable. 24 hours. Possibly less. She pushed through the ER doors and went back to work because there was nothing else to do, and because whatever was coming was going to arrive whether she was standing still or moving, and she had always been better at moving. She pushed through the ER doors and went back to work because there was nothing else to do, and because whatever was coming was going to arrive whether she was standing still or moving, and she had always been better at moving. The morning floor received her without ceremony. 2 new patients in triage, a child with a suspected broken wrist, an elderly man with chest pain that was probably anxiety but required ruling out. Rodriguez handed her a chart without looking up from his own. The overhead lights were the same lights they always were. The floor smelled like disinfectant and bad coffee, and the particular synthetic warmth of a building that was heated just slightly too high. Mara moved through the first hour of her shift with the surface appearance of someone entirely present in the ordinary work of the morning, while a separate part of her mind ran a different calculation on a continuous loop. The man in the corridor outside Warwick's room had asked for her by full name. Both names? Precise? No hesitation. That meant a list. That meant someone with access to hospital staff records, or someone who had already done the work of connecting Mara Voss, ER nurse at Harlow Memorial, to whatever name appeared in the documentation Warwick had submitted to the review board. The review board had been notified 4 minutes before Martinez told her. The 2 senior officials whose signatures were on the order that erased her records had been notified at the same time. 4 minutes was enough time to make a phone call. She checked the elderly man's EKG. Normal sinus rhythm, elevated rate consistent with anxiety, no ST changes. She told him what she saw, clearly and without condescension, and watched his shoulders drop 2 inches with relief. She ordered the follow-up blood work the attending would want and moved on. At 11:15, Bev Okafor appeared at her elbow again. Bev had a gift for materializing at significant moments, which Mara had always attributed to 11 years of charge nurse pattern recognition rather than anything supernatural. "There's a man at the front desk," Bev said quietly, "asking for you. He's not a patient. He's not family of a patient. He told the desk clerk he's here on official business. She paused. He has a federal identification. Mara kept her eyes on the chart in her hands. What agency? The clerk didn't write it down. She said it looked like DOD, Department of Defense. Not unexpected, given what Martinez had told her. The question was which direction, someone from the review board's investigative arm or someone from the other direction entirely, sent not to open an inquiry. Ones. Tell the desk I'll be out in 10 minutes, Mara said. She wasn't out in 10 minutes. She spent those 10 minutes doing something specific. She went to the nurse's locker room, opened her locker, and retrieved a small waterproof envelope she had kept in the back of it since her 3rd week at Harlow Memorial. She had told herself, when she put it there, that she was being paranoid. She had told herself that every 6 months since. The envelope contained a USB drive, a single index card with 3 phone numbers written in pen, and a folded sheet of paper with a handwritten note she had written to herself in the 1st week after arriving in Denton, when everything was still raw and she still hadn't decided whether to disappear completely or leave a thread for someone to eventually find. She put the envelope in the front pocket of her scrubs. Then she went to the lobby. The man waiting for her was in his mid-40s, well-dressed in the specific way of federal employees who wore suits to places where suits were slightly wrong, the jacket too stiff, the tie too careful, the shoes too polished for a hospital. He had the face of someone who had been doing a particular kind of work for long enough that the face had started to reflect it, closed, watchful, professionally pleasant in a way that didn't reach the eyes. He stood when she came through the lobby door. Nurse Voss? He offered a badge and a leather holder. She looked at it. DOD, as Bev had said. The name read Aldrich Soren, Deputy Liaison, Office of Special Operations Oversight. Mr. Soren, she said, I apologize for coming to your workplace. He didn't look particularly apologetic. I'm here because there's a time-sensitive situation involving documentation recently submitted to a military review board. We believe you may have information relevant to the inquiry. I'm on shift, she said. I understand. This won't take long. He gestured toward a seating area near the lobby windows. The kind of gesture that framed a request as a courtesy while communicating clearly that it wasn't optional. Mara sat. He sat across from her. You know Colonel James Warwick, he said. He's a patient in this hospital. And previously, you have a prior association. I'd like to understand the nature of this inquiry before I answer questions about prior associations, she said, keeping her voice pleasant and her expression cooperative and her guard at absolute maximum. Soren looked at her with the eyes of someone recalibrating. She watched him do it, watched him revise whatever model he'd arrived with, the one that had probably told him she'd be cooperative or frightened or both, watched him file the revision and proceed. The review board has received materials related to Operation Caldera, he said, an operation that concluded 7 years ago. The materials include testimony that references a classified medical specialist whose records were subsequently removed from military databases. He paused. We're trying to establish the provenance of those materials. Provenance, she repeated. Where they came from, who compiled them, whether the testimony is supported by verifiable record. Sounds like something the review board would determine. The review board has a process, he said. That process takes time. In the interim, there are concerns about the integrity of the submitted materials, about whether they were obtained through appropriate channels. Mara looked at him. She had been in enough rooms with enough people who spoke in this particular register to understand exactly what was being communicated under the language. The submitted materials were real, and the people implicated by them knew they were real, and what this man had been sent to do, politely, officially, in a hospital lobby with a DOD badge and a careful suit, was to find out what she knew, how much, and whether there was a way to complicate her credibility before the review board got to her. I don't have any information about how those materials were compiled, she said. I'm a nurse. I've been in Denton for 3 years. Of course. He nodded. Can I ask what you were doing before Denton? Working. In what capacity? Various. She held his gaze. Is there a specific question you'd like to ask, Mr. Soren? Because I have patients waiting. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket and produced a card. Standard Federal Issue, embossed lettering, direct line. He placed it on the chair beside her. "If you think of anything relevant," he said, "I'll keep that in mind." He stood, buttoned his jacket, and left the way he'd come in, through the main lobby doors, out into the gray Denton morning. Mara watched him go. She watched him reach the parking lot, cross to a dark SUV parked in the visitor section, and get in. He didn't leave immediately. She counted. The SUV sat in this parking lot for 4 minutes before it pulled out, long enough to make a call, long enough to relay that she hadn't confirmed anything and hadn't denied anything and was going to need a different approach. She went back to the ER floor. The next 3 hours were the kind of busy that Mara normally appreciated, the kind that required full attention and left no cognitive space for anything else. A multi-vehicle accident on the highway outside Denton sent 5 people into the ER in quick succession. 2 were serious, 1 critical, requiring the full trauma team and reset his best, which was, she could admit this without complication, genuinely very good. She worked Bay 2, managing a woman with a crush injury to the lower leg that was going to need vascular surgery, keeping the pressure stable, communicating with the surgical team, doing the specific complex work of holding a situation together while the more dramatic interventions happened in the next room. She did not think about Soren. She thought about the woman in Bay 2, whose name was Joanna, who kept asking about her dog. "My dog was in the car," Joanna said, during a moment when her pain medication had brought her to a more lucid window. "Is my dog okay? Nobody will tell me about my dog." "What's the dog's name?" Mara asked, checking the pulse oximetry. "Brick. He's a beagle." Her eyes were wet. "He was in the back seat." "I'll find out," Mara said, and she meant it. And 40 minutes later, she tracked down a paramedic from the accident scene who confirmed that the beagle had been taken by animal control and was uninjured. And she went back to Joanna and told her, and the relief on the woman's face was the kind of thing that didn't make it into any chart or any record, but was part of the actual work. At 2:30 p.m., Reese found her. He looked different than he had in the medication room. The uncertain quality was gone, replaced by something harder and more purposeful, which she read as a sign that he'd been thinking rather than just reacting. "My office," he said. Not a suggestion. His office was a small room off the main corridor with a window that faced the ambulance bay. He closed the door. She stood near the window. He sat behind his desk in the way people sat behind desks when they wanted the desk between them. "I made some calls this morning," he said. She waited. "I have a contact at Madigan Army Medical Center. We were in residency together. He's been there 15 years. He looked at her. I described the situation. Not by name, just a nurse, former military, removed from service 7 years ago, medical specialist background. He didn't recognize the specific situation, but he knew the type. "The type," she said. "He said there were several cases in that period. Medical personnel with classified unit assignments whose records were altered or removed after specific operations. He said it wasn't common, but it happened, and it happened most often when the personnel in question had become inconvenient." He paused. He used that word, inconvenient. Mara said nothing. "I also looked at your personnel file here," Reese said. "Not the classified parts. You don't have classified parts, officially. But I looked at what's there. Your nursing certifications are impeccable. Your continuing education record is extraordinary. The range of procedures you're certified in is wider than most attendings I know." He looked at her steadily. "The clinical instincts you've demonstrated on this floor are not nursing school instincts, Voss. They're not even attending-level instincts. They're the instincts of someone who has been the most qualified person in a room with nothing but bad options and learned to think that way." The ambulance bay outside the window was quiet. The gray sky pressed down on the hospital. "What do you want from me, Dr. Reese?" she asked. "I want to understand what's happening in my hospital," he said. "A federal official came to the lobby and asked for you. A military colonel is upstairs asking for you. 2 of my nurses mentioned that someone else came through the main entrance an hour ago and asked at reception if you were on shift." He leaned forward. "Someone else?" That landed differently than the rest of it. She kept it from showing. "I don't know who that would be," she said, which was only partially true. "Neither do I, which is why I'm asking." He was quiet for a second. "Are you in danger?" She considered the question as though she hadn't already been considering it for the past 6 hours. I don't know yet. That's not reassuring. It wasn't meant to be. She looked at him directly. I appreciate what you're telling me, and I understand that it's coming from a place of, I think, genuine concern. But there are things I can't explain to you right now, and the reason I can't explain them is not because I don't trust you. It's because the more people who are visibly associated with this situation, the more complicated it gets for everyone involved. Reese was quiet. He had the look of a man who wanted to push further and was doing the calculation about whether pushing would get him anywhere useful. If you need anything, he said finally, if the situation changes and you need backup from this direction, I'm here. She hadn't expected that. She felt it land somewhere unexpected. Thank you, she said. She meant it. At 4 p.m., the situation changed. She was in the medication room when Rodriguez came in with an expression that she had learned to read over 3 years of working beside him. He was not a dramatic person, which meant that when his face did something, it was worth paying attention to. There are 2 men on the floor, he said quietly. They came in through the staff entrance. Bev is trying to figure out who authorized them. They're asking the residents questions about you. What kind of questions? How long you've worked here, whether you've seemed agitated recently, whether you've been in contact with any military personnel. He paused. One of them tried to access the staff computer at Bay 3, the overnight login records. The medication room was very small. It felt smaller. Did they identify themselves? She asked. One of them showed a badge to one of the residents. She said it wasn't the same as the federal ID the morning visitor had. Different agency. She couldn't read the full lettering. Different agency. Not the review board. Not DoD oversight. She put down the medication she'd been logging and moved to the door. Where's Bev? Nurse's station. Bev was at the nurse's station with the expression of a woman who had been managing a hospital floor for 11 years and was not accustomed to having unauthorized personnel accessing her staff computers. She looked up when Mara appeared. I've called hospital security, Bev said, and I've called the administrator on duty. Whatever these men are here for, they don't have floor authorization. Where are they now? One's in the corridor near Bay 4, the other went toward the elevator. Mara's chest went cold. The elevator. 3rd floor. Warwick. She moved. Not running, because you didn't run in a hospital unless the situation required it, and she was calculating in real time whether this situation required it. Calculating based on the fact that Warwick was post-surgical, that he had a cardiac arrhythmia in his chart, that he was the person whose testimony had started this process, and was therefore also the most valuable target if someone wanted to slow that process down, and that the man who had gone toward the elevator was moving with the specific purposefulness she'd seen in people who knew exactly where they were going. She took the stairs. 3 flights, fast, with the limp that she'd stopped noticing a long time ago. The knee that had taken fragmentation damage during the extraction that ended her career had left her with a gait that was slightly uneven under normal conditions and became more so under speed. But she had learned to compensate, had learned to push through the specific burning sensation that flared with the impact of stairs taken quickly, and she was through the 3rd floor door before the elevator could have arrived. The corridor was quiet. The nurse at the station at the far end looked up, saw her, looked confused. Room 312's door was closed. She moved toward it. The door opened before she reached it, and the man who came out was not Martinez and was not a hospital staff member, and he pulled up short when he saw her in a way that confirmed he knew who she was and had not expected to encounter her here. He was younger than Soren, less polished, the kind of person who was good at being in rooms without being noticed, not the suit and badge approach, the quieter version, the one that moved through institutional spaces using the body language of someone who belonged there. He had been in the room, with Warwick, alone. Who are you? Mara said, not a question. He didn't answer. He looked at her with the assessment speed of someone running the same kind of calculation she was, and then he started moving, not toward her, past her, toward the stairwell door at the other end of the corridor. She let him go. She pushed through the door of 312. Warwick was in the bed, upright. Too upright again, she registered. And his face had a sharpness to it that hadn't been there this morning, the anesthesia fog entirely gone, replaced by something alert and focused. And underneath that, something that looked like controlled anger. Martinez was on the far side of the room. She'd been pushed back, Literally, physically, the chair she'd been sitting in was now at the wrong angle, and there was a small cut on her lower lip that was fresh. "What happened?" Mara asked. "He wanted the documentation," Warwick said. His voice was tight. "The copies, the ones I submitted to the review board. He wanted to know if I had additional copies beyond what was submitted." "Do you?" "Yes." He held her gaze. "Encrypted, off-site. He didn't get that information." Martinez touched the cut on her lip with 2 fingers. "He wasn't there to ask nicely," she said. "He was there to assess what we have and report back." "They know the review is real," Mara said. She was thinking out loud, working the shape of it. "They know the documentation is solid enough to be a problem. They're not trying to stop the formal review. That's too visible now. Too many people involved. They're trying to find out how much exists so they can figure out what they're actually facing." "Which means they're afraid," Martinez said. "Which means they're dangerous," Mara corrected. "Afraid people with resources are dangerous. They're not trying to bury this quietly anymore. They're in triage mode." She looked at Warwick. He looked back at her with the expression she'd been circling around since 1:30 in the morning, the one that said he had been waiting for her to get to the same place he'd been standing for 2 years. "I need an answer," he said. "Not the one you gave me this morning." She stood in the room and thought about 3 years of silence. About the coffee-stained scrubs and the night shifts and the limp she'd learned to hide and the careful art of being nobody. About Private Owen Talley's chest expanding correctly in Bay 1 and Joanna asking about her dog, and Bev Okafor's 11 years of knowing exactly what was happening on her floor. She thought about the man who'd been in this room, about Soren in the lobby, about the second one at Bay 3's computer, looking at login records, trying to build a picture of who she was now, so that whoever had sent them could figure out how to make her into someone whose testimony wouldn't hold. She had spent 7 years being the person they'd made her into. Invisible. Removed. Erased. "I'll cooperate with the review board," she said. "Formally. On record." Warwick let out a breath that she could hear. "I need the JAG team here," she continued. "Not tomorrow. Today. Before whatever just left this floor makes a phone call, and that phone call results in a version of me that's harder to cooperate with." "I can have them in Denton by 6, Martinez said, already reaching for her phone. "I also need Rees," Mara said. Both of them looked at her. "My attending. He knows something is happening. He's going to know more in the next few hours whether I tell him or not." She looked at Warwick. "If I'm going to do this, I need the people in this building to understand what's happening. Because whatever comes next, it's coming here, to this hospital, and the people who work here deserve to know what's walking through their doors." Warwick nodded once. Martinez stepped into the corner and began making calls. Mara stood at the window of room 312 and looked out at the hills east of Denton, wet from last night's rain, heavy and dark against the late afternoon gray. And she felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Not safety. Nothing about the next 24 hours was going to be safe. But solid. The specific sensation of standing on something real after years of standing on air. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out, looked at the screen. Unknown number. She answered. The voice on the other end was one she didn't recognize. Male, middle-aged, unhurried in the way of someone who was unhurried because they believed they had more leverage than the person they were calling. "Nurse Voss," he said. "I think it's time we talked about what happens to people who involve themselves in matters that were resolved a long time ago." She looked out the window. "I don't think this matter was resolved," she said. "I think it was interrupted." A pause on the other end. Short, but there. "You should think very carefully," the voice said, "about how much you're willing to lose. You've built something in Denton. People know you there. Situations can change." Mara looked at the hills, at the dark tree line, at the sky. "I've already lost everything once," she said. "It didn't stop me then." She ended the call. She held the phone in her hand for a moment. Then she turned back to the room, where Martinez was still on her phone and Warwick was watching her with the steady attention of a man who had just watched someone make a decision he'd been waiting 2 years for. "The JAG team," she said. "What time did you say?" 6 o'clock, Martinez said, phone still to her ear. "Tell them to make it 5, Mara said, and tell them to come in through the ambulance bay entrance, not the main lobby." Martinez relayed the instruction without question. Mara looked at Warwick. "I'm going back to my floor." "Mara." She stopped. "The call sign they gave you," he said. In the unit, you remember it? She did. She had spent 3 years trying not to remember it. Phoenix, he said before she could answer. They called you Phoenix because of what you did on the Bareva extraction, because you went into a burning situation and came back out with 4 people who weren't supposed to make it. His jaw set. That's not a coincidence of naming, that's a description. She stood in the doorway. It's also the reason they were so determined to bury you, he said. Because the people they needed to discredit most were the ones who were hardest to discredit, the ones whose record was clearest. He held her gaze. They're going to come at you hard, Mara, in the next few hours, before the JAG team arrives. They're going to come at everything you've built here. She absorbed that. I know, she said. She went back to her floor. She came through the ER doors at 4:47 p.m., and Bev Okafor was at the nurses' station, and Rodriguez was beside her, and 2 hospital security officers were in the corridor near Bay 4 with expressions that suggested the situation had continued developing in her absence. And Reese was there too, standing in the middle of the floor with his arms crossed, and the look of a man who had spent the last 20 minutes being told things that were rearranging his understanding of the past 3 years. And when he saw her come through the doors, he said, Voss, my office, now. And this time I need you to actually tell me what's happening. She looked at the clock on the wall, 4:47, just over an hour before the JAG team arrived. She nodded. She followed him toward his office. She was 3 steps from the door when the hospital's overhead alert system activated. Not a patient code, not a trauma alert. The other one, the one she had only heard once in 3 years, in a drill. Security lockdown. All exterior entrances. And then, cutting through the alert tone coming from the direction of the main lobby, she heard something that overrode every calculation she'd been running. She heard Dr. Reese's name being called over the PA system, and then her name immediately after it, and then a voice she didn't recognize. Not Soren, not the man from the corridor, not the voice from the phone. Authoritative, controlled, carrying the specific weight of someone who had just arrived and intended to make that arrival count. The voice said, "This is Colonel Denise Hargrove, Judge Advocate General's Corps, United States Army. I need Nurse Mara Voss and Dr. Callum Reese to report to the main conference room immediately. I also need security to ensure that no individual without hospital credentials leaves this building until my team has completed a preliminary review." Mara stopped walking. The JAG team wasn't supposed to be here for another hour. They were here now, and they had locked down the building, which meant they had information she didn't have, which meant something had escalated in the time between Martinez's phone call and this moment, and the specific quality of Colonel Hargrove's voice over the PA. Controlled but carrying something underneath the control, something that sounded like urgency wearing a professional mask, told her that whatever had escalated was significant. Reese was looking at her. "Conference room," she said. They moved. The main conference room was on the ground floor, off the administrative corridor, a room used for staff meetings and family consultations and the occasional credentialing review. It had 6 chairs around a table and a whiteboard on the wall that still had last Tuesday's staff meeting agenda written on it in blue marker. Colonel Denise Hargrove was standing at the head of the table. She was in her 50s, in uniform, with the bearing of someone who had been doing difficult work in difficult circumstances for a long time, and had stopped being surprised by any of it. Beside her was a younger officer Mara didn't recognize, and a civilian woman with a laptop open who appeared to be a legal clerk. 2 hospital security officers were in the doorway. Martinez was already in the room. She'd come down from the 3rd floor, apparently, in the time it had taken Mara to cross the ER floor. Warwick was not there. He was still in surgery recovery, which was where he needed to stay. Hargrove looked at Mara when she walked in, and the look was direct, assessing, and, under that, something Mara couldn't quite name for the first second. Then she named it. Recognition. Not personal recognition, they had never met. The recognition of a file, of documentation reviewed carefully, of a person who had been described to her in enough detail that she knew, looking at Mara, exactly who was standing in front of her. "Nurse Voss," Hargrove said. "Colonel. We've moved up the timeline because of developments in the past 2 hours." She didn't sit. She kept standing, and everyone else in the room took the cue. 3 individuals have been identified attempting to access hospital records and make contact with persons relevant to the review. 2 of them are now in federal custody. The 3rd is unaccounted for. She looked at Mara steadily. The individuals had documentation identifying them as contractors. The contracting firm traces back to a private security company with documented financial ties to Brigadier General Victor Hartfield. The name landed in the room like something physical. Mara had not heard that name spoken aloud in 7 years. She had thought it in the dark, in the first months after Denton, when she was still processing what had happened, before she'd made the decision to stop processing and start surviving. She had written it once on a piece of paper and then burned the paper, because writing it felt like a liability. Standing in a conference room in Harlow Memorial Medical Center, hearing it said out loud by a JAG colonel, was a different experience entirely. Victor Hartfield, Reese said beside her. He said it in the tone of someone who recognized a name from news, not from personal history. Retired Brigadier General, Hargrove said. Former head of Special Operations Command Oversight, Western Sector. He retired 4 years ago. He has been a subject of the review documentation submitted by Colonel Warwick. She paused. He has also, as of 2 hours ago, retained legal counsel and made contact with the review board directly, attempting to dispute the admissibility of the submitted materials. He knows the review is active, Martinez said. He's known since this morning. When he retained counsel, he also made 3 phone calls. We have records of 2 of them. The third, Hargrove looked at Mara. We believe the third was to the individual who called you at 4:30 this afternoon. Mara absorbed that. They'd been monitoring the calls. The JAG team had been active longer than this morning. They'd been moving before Martinez had called them, before Warwick had made any overt request. How long has the review been active? She asked. Formally, 6 weeks since the documentation was submitted. Hargrove held her gaze. Informally, the JAG office has been aware of the Caldera situation for 14 months. We've been building the secondary record independently, waiting for a primary witness. The whiteboard behind Hargrove still had Tuesday's staff meeting agenda in blue marker. Quarterly scheduling review. New triage protocol rollout. Coffee fund reminder. Mara looked at it and felt the absurd juxtaposition of it, the gap between the ordinary machinery of a hospital week and what was happening in this room. I'll give testimony, she said. Full. On record, everything I witnessed before, during, and after Operation Caldera, everything I reported through official channels, and what happened after I reported it. Hargrove nodded once. Professional. No excess. I also have documentation, Mara said. The room shifted. She reached into the front pocket of her scrubs and retrieved the waterproof envelope she'd taken from her locker that morning. She set it on the table. Hargrove looked at it without moving toward it. What's on the drive? She asked. Copies of the reports I filed. The originals that I was told had been submitted through proper channels and were then removed from the record. I made copies before I left. She paused. I've been carrying them for 3 years. Hargrove looked at her for a long moment with an expression that had something human in it. Something that was almost, not quite, but almost. The expression of someone who understood exactly what it meant to carry something for 3 years waiting for the right room. We'll need to verify the materials, she said. I know. The legal clerk reached across and took the envelope carefully, as though it were something fragile. Which it was, Mara thought, in the sense that it was the only copy of 3 years of waiting that existed in a form that could be handed to someone. Colonel Hargrove, Martinez said, the third contractor, the one who was in Colonel Warwick's room. Is he a threat to the colonel? We have a security detail on the 3rd floor, Hargrove said. Warwick is covered. She looked at Mara again. You, however, are less covered. Given that you've now formally agreed to provide testimony, you are the primary witness in an active review that changes your exposure profile. I understand that, Mara said. Do you have somewhere secure to be tonight, outside this building? She thought about her apartment, the spare room, and the 2 locks on the door, and the particular silence of a place that had been carefully, deliberately, minimally furnished. The place she had built to be easy to leave if leaving became necessary. I'll manage, she said. That's not... The door to the conference room opened. Everyone in the room looked up. The person in the doorway was not hospital staff, not military, not the security officers from the lobby. It was Private Owen Talley, 23 years old, from Idaho, in a hospital gown with an IV line still in his arm, barefoot, looking slightly pale but entirely purposeful, with the particular expression of a young man who had decided to do something and was not going to be talked out of it. He looked past Hargrove and Martinez and Reese and the legal clerk and found Mara directly. "I heard they locked down the building," he said. "I heard it was something to do with the nurse who—" He stopped, looked at her. "Was it you, last night, in the bay?" The room waited. "Yes," Mara said. He nodded, slow. Then he looked at the colonel, at the JAG insignia, at the legal clerk with the envelope. "I don't know what's happening," he said, "but I've got 4 guys upstairs who are alive because someone knew what they were doing last night." His jaw was set in the particular way of someone very young, trying very hard to carry themselves like something older. "I don't know if that matters to whatever this is, but if someone needs a soldier to say so, officially, I'll say so." The room was quiet. Hargrove looked at the young man in the doorway with an expression that was not quite professional anymore. Mara looked at him too, and she felt something that she had no clean name for. Not sentimentality, because sentimentality was not something she'd been able to afford for a very long time, but something adjacent to it, something that sat in the chest and pressed. "Go back to your room, Private," she said. "Rest." "Will someone tell me what's happening?" "Later," she said. "I promise." He looked at her for another second. Then he nodded and turned and walked back down the corridor in his hospital gown, the IV line trailing, barefoot on the hospital floor, with more dignity than most people managed fully dressed. Mara turned back to the room. Hargrove was looking at her with the same expression she'd worn when Mara had set the envelope on the table. Almost, not quite, but almost. Something human. "Let's start at the beginning," Hargrove said. "Operation Caldera. What you witnessed, what you reported. And what happened when you reported it." Mara pulled out a chair. She sat down. And for the first time in 7 years, she began to talk. And for the first time in 7 years, she began to talk. She started with the operational briefing, the one she'd received 14 days before Caldera launched, in a room with no windows and a classification level that meant the 12 people present couldn't discuss it with anyone outside that room, including family, including other unit members, including the chaplain. Some of them would have wanted to speak to afterward. She described the mission parameters as she'd understood them. A medical extraction in a contested area, high-value personnel, a window of less than 6 hours before the geopolitical situation made the operation impossible to deniably conduct. Hargrove listened without interrupting. The legal clerk typed. Martinez stood by the wall with her arms crossed and her expression carefully neutral. Reese sat at the far end of the table and did not take notes and did not speak, and absorbed everything with the attentiveness of a man who was reconstructing a picture he'd been looking at for 3 years without the context to understand what he was seeing. Mara talked for 40 minutes straight. She described what she'd seen on the ground, the extraction site, the conditions, the wounded personnel she'd been assigned to stabilize. She described the secondary situation that she had not been briefed on, the evidence of a prior operation, recent, that had gone badly, badly wrong, in a way that the official record she'd been shown before the mission did not account for. She described the bodies. She used the clinical language she'd trained herself to use for things that were not clinical, because clinical language was the only way to say some things without the words breaking apart in your mouth. She described what she found in the field commander's documents, not the tactical intelligence. She had no authorization to discuss tactical intelligence, and Hargrove's team knew this and was not asking for it. She described the administrative documents. The ones that showed the prior operation had not been an intelligence failure or a weather event, or any of the 3 explanations that had appeared in the after-action summary she'd been given. The ones that showed it had been something else, something deliberate, something that had served a set of interests she could document but not, at the time, fully explain. She described bringing those documents to her commanding officer. She described his face when he read them. She described the 48 hours after that, the calls she was told were being made, the process she was told was being followed, the assurances she was given that the appropriate channels were handling it. She described the morning she woke up and her military access was revoked. She described the call she received from a JAG officer, not Hargrove, someone she'd never identified by name, telling her that her records were under administrative review and she should not attempt to access military databases or make contact with unit personnel pending the outcome of that review. She described the outcome of that review, which was that there was no outcome because the review was not real. She described Denton. When she finished, the room was quiet in the specific way of rooms where everyone present has just been handed something heavy and is deciding how to hold it. Hargrove said, "The documents you found in the field, you made copies before you left." "I made copies before I understood what was going to happen," Mara said. "I made them as a standard practice. I was trained to document everything in the field because documentation was the difference between an after-action review that captured what actually occurred and one that captured what someone decided should have occurred." She paused. "I didn't know, when I copied them, that I was going to need them to prove I existed." Hargrove looked at the envelope the legal clerk had set to one side. "We'll have the drive analyzed tonight. If the documents match what you've described, they corroborate the materials Colonel Warwick submitted at a primary source level." She looked at Mara directly. "That's significant, Nurse Voss. Corroboration at that level is what turns an inquiry into an indictment." Mara heard the word. She let it settle. "What happens to Hartfield?" she asked. "That's not something I can detail in a preliminary interview," Hargrove said. "But I can tell you that the materials already submitted have been reviewed by 3 senior JAG officers and the Office of the Inspector General. The question is not whether action is warranted. The question has been the evidence threshold." She paused. "Your testimony and this documentation moves us past that threshold." Reese spoke for the first time since Mara had begun. His voice was even, the voice of a man who had processed something large and had come out the other side of the processing with questions rather than reactions. "The people who came into this hospital today," he said, "the contractors. They were sent to find out what she had." "Yes," Hargrove said, meaning Hartfield knew that if she talked, it was over. "Yes." Reese was quiet for a moment. Then he said to Mara specifically, 3 years. You've been in my ER for 3 years." She looked at him. "Yes." "And the whole time I was a nurse," she said. That part wasn't complicated. Something moved in his expression. Not quite an apology. He'd already gotten closer to one than she'd expected in the medication room that morning. This was something different. The look of a person revising not just a specific judgment, but the criteria they'd been using to make it. He didn't say anything else. That was fine. The analysis of the drive took 2 hours, conducted by a specialist Hargrove's team had brought with them, a woman in civilian clothes who set up a portable forensic workstation in the corner of the conference room and worked with the concentrated silence of someone who had done this many times under worse conditions. Mara watched the process intermittently, stepping out to check on the floor, checking in with Bev, covering 2 patient assessments that couldn't wait. The hospital was still under security lockdown. Exterior entrances monitored, the 2 contractors in federal custody, the 3rd still unaccounted for. The staff had been told there was an ongoing security situation related to a patient, which was true, and that they should continue normal operations, which they were doing with the particular focused and not asking quality of people who had learned that asking questions about security situations in hospitals usually produced less clarity than just doing their jobs. Rodriguez met her at the nurse's station during one of her check-ins. "You okay?" he asked. It was a simple question. She was aware of the ways it wasn't simple. "Working on it," she said. "Private Tally asked about you again. He's back in his room. He wanted me to tell you—" Rodriguez paused, slightly awkwardly. "He said to tell you he meant what he said, about speaking up officially." She looked at Rodriguez for a moment. He was 27, second year as an ER nurse, came from a family of nurses, had the kind of fundamental steadiness that she'd learned was the most important quality in this work. Not brilliance, not speed, steadiness. He had never asked her about her past. He had never questioned her competence. He had simply worked beside her for 2 years and accepted what he found there. "Thank you," she said, "for covering the floor today." "That's the job," he said. She went back to the conference room. The forensic specialist looked up when Mara came through the door. Hargrove was standing beside her, looking at the screen. "The documents are authentic," the specialist said. Without preamble, without ceremony, the way people in her particular line of work delivered findings. The metadata is consistent with the stated time period. The encryption format matches the field documentation system used by that unit at that time. The file structure shows no signs of post-creation modification. She looked at Mara. "These were created in the field when you said they were created, and they haven't been touched since." Mara sat down in the nearest chair. Not because her legs gave out, but because the alternative was standing there holding the weight of that sentence while everyone in the room watched, and sitting was a way to take that weight without it being visible. 7 years. The documents had existed for 7 years, and she had moved them from location to location and kept them encrypted and never opened the drive after the first year because opening it had been too close to believing something would eventually come of it. And now a forensic specialist in a Denton hospital conference room had just looked at the metadata and confirmed that everything she'd said was true. She had known it was true. She had known it every day for 7 years. Knowing and having it confirmed in a room full of people who could act on the confirmation were different experiences. Colonel Hargrove, Martinez said, looking at her phone. The IG's office has been notified. They're requesting a video conference in 30 minutes. Hargrove nodded. She looked at Mara. I need you available for the next several hours. Is there someone who can cover your remaining shift? Mara thought of Bev. Yes. Good. Hargrove held her gaze. I want to say something that isn't part of the official record. Mara waited. What was done to you was not a failure of process, Hargrove said. It was a deliberate subversion of it. The people responsible counted on the process being slow and you being isolated, and the distance between what happened and what was documented being wide enough that nobody would be able to close it. She paused. They underestimated the documentation, and they underestimated you. Mara said nothing. That's all, Hargrove said, and moved on, because she was the kind of person who said important things once and then moved on, which Mara found she respected. The video conference with the Inspector General's office lasted 90 minutes and included 4 senior officers, 2 civilian attorneys from the IG's Review Division, and a representative from the Senate Armed Services Committee oversight staff, who was patched in from Washington. Mara provided testimony on camera, on record, formally, with Hargrove present and the legal clerk capturing everything. She answered questions for 45 minutes straight. They were specific questions, detailed, drilling into the operational particulars with the precision of people who had already built a significant portion of the case and were now looking for the connective tissue, the moments and details that would make the narrative of what had happened impossible to dispute or reframe. She gave them everything she had. She was not perfect in the giving. There were moments where she needed to pause, where the clinical distance she used to talk about some things had to be rebuilt in real time, where the questioner waited with professional patience while she found the words. There was one moment where she was describing the 48 hours after she reported to her commanding officer. The calls, the assurances, the systematic dissolution of everything she'd been told was being handled. And she stopped speaking for approximately 10 seconds. Nobody rushed her. She started speaking again. When it was finished, the IG's representative said, "The review board will issue formal findings within 72 hours. Based on what we've received today, the prior documentation, Colonel Warwick's testimony, and now yours. I'm authorized to tell you that the findings will include a formal recommendation for the restoration of your service record and recognition of the commendations that were removed." She had expected to feel something larger at that. What she felt was tired, not relieved, not vindicated, just the bone-level exhaustion of a person who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had just set it down and had not yet figured out what their body did now that the weight was gone. "Thank you," she said. The screens went dark. But Victor Hartfield was formally notified of the active indictment recommendation at 8:15 p.m. Hargrove told Mara this in the conference room, with Martinez and the legal clerk present, reading from a communication that had just come through from the IG's office. "He's been advised not to leave his current location pending formal proceedings," Hargrove said. "His legal counsel has been in contact with the review board. The official statement will be released to the relevant oversight committees tomorrow morning." "What does that mean for the contractors he sent here today?" Mara asked. "The 2 in custody are facing federal charges for unauthorized access to private medical records and obstruction of a federal review. The third..." Hargrove looked up from the communication. "The third was located 40 minutes ago. He's in federal custody." All three of them in custody. Mara sat with that. "There are going to be hearings," Hargrove continued. "The committee staff member you spoke with today will be recommending a formal congressional hearing on the Caldera operation and the subsequent record modifications. That process takes time. Months, potentially." She looked at Mara. Your participation will be required, not optional. I understand. I also want you to understand that the public nature of that process, the hearing, the committee record, means that the information about who you are and what was done will become part of a public record. If you've been managing your privacy carefully, I have. That changes. Mara looked at the whiteboard behind Hargrove. The staff meeting agenda was still there, coffee fund reminder. Someone had drawn a small star next to it, which suggested the coffee fund had been a point of some feeling. I've been managing my privacy because there was nothing else I could do, she said. If there's something else I can do now, I'd rather do that. Hargrove looked at her for a moment. Get some rest tonight, she said. We have a room secured in the hospital, the on-call suite, 3rd floor. I'd like you to stay in building until the morning. Because of the third contractor? Because we're in the middle of something that isn't finished yet, and I'd rather have you where my team can see you. It was honest, which Mara appreciated. The third contractor was in custody before he made contact with anyone, but Hartfield has resources beyond the 3 men he sent today, and until the formal indictment recommendation is processed and the public statement is released tomorrow, he still has operational latitude. Mara nodded. She went back to the ER floor one more time before accepting the on-call suite. She updated her charts, the ones she'd been in the middle of when the afternoon had stopped being an ordinary shift. And she checked on the evening triage situation and confirmed that the overnight team had their assignments. She looked in on Private Tally, who was asleep, his breathing easy and regular, the monitor above his bed running its steady green line. She stood in the doorway of his bay for a moment. 23 years old. She went to the on-call suite. The suite was small, a narrow bed, a private bathroom, a window that faced the hospital's internal courtyard rather than the outside. She had slept in worse places, considerably worse. She lay down with her clothes on and her phone on the mattress beside her, and looked at the ceiling and did the things she had always done when she needed to slow down. She counted her breathing, not meditatively, just mechanically, because the mechanical process of counting gave the part of her mind that generated catastrophic scenarios something to do that wasn't generating catastrophic scenarios. She slept. At 5:45 a.m., her phone vibrated. Warwick. Text message. Short. Hargrove just briefed me. You did it. She lay in the narrow bed and looked at those 4 words for a moment. You did it. She thought about telling him it wasn't her alone, that it was him, that it was the 6 unit members whose testimony had started the process, that it was Martinez's cut lip and Tally showing up in a hospital gown and Bev Okafor calling security the moment something was wrong on her floor. She thought about telling him all of that. She typed back, we did it. She set the phone down. She lay there in the gray early morning light and let herself feel, carefully, the particular shape of what had happened yesterday. The testimony. The documentation authenticated. Hartfield formally notified. The JAG team present and operational and not going to be undone by a phone call from a man who had spent 7 years believing the phone call was enough. She let herself feel it for exactly as long as it took her to understand that feeling it wasn't the same as it being finished. Because it wasn't finished. Hartfield was notified, not charged. The indictment was recommended, not issued. The hearings were scheduled, not held. The record restoration was recommended, not processed. Everything that had happened yesterday was the beginning of the mechanism, not the end. And mechanisms of this type were slow and complicated and had a history of producing unexpected friction at unexpected points. She got up, washed her face, looked at herself in the mirror. She looked tired. She looked older than she usually let herself notice. She looked like a person who had slept 4 hours in a hospital on-call suite after the most consequential day of the past 7 years, which was exactly what she was. She went back to the ER floor. Hargrove found her at 7:30 a.m. in the medication room, the same medication room where Reese had been direct with her the morning before. It seemed like longer than 24 hours ago. It seemed, in the particular compressed time way of events that changed the shape of things, like something that had happened in a different version of the building. The official statement goes out at 9, Hargrove said, from the IG's office. It names Hartfield. It references the review. It doesn't name you, not in the initial release. Your participation is protected until the hearing. But eventually, yes, eventually you'll be named. The hearing is a public process. Mara absorbed that. What does the statement say specifically about the record modifications? That between 7 and 8 years ago, the service records of multiple personnel assigned to a classified unit were modified or removed without legal authorization, at the direction of an officer who has since been identified. That those modifications were part of a deliberate effort to suppress witness testimony related to operational misconduct. Hargrove paused. And that the process of restoring those records has been initiated. How many people had their records modified? 12. 12. She had known there were others, she had suspected it, had found the edges of it in the documents she'd copied, but she hadn't known the number. 12 people who had spent some version of the last 7 years doing what she'd done, building a life inside the space of what had been taken. Are the others? She started. The review team has been in contact with 6 of them, Hargrove said. The other 6 are in various stages of being located. Some have been harder to find than you were. As though she had been found rather than having walked into a trauma bay on a Tuesday night and encountered the one person who could identify her. Some of them probably don't want to be found, Mara said. Some of them probably don't, Hargrove agreed. That's their right. The record restoration doesn't require their participation. It happens because the evidence supports it. Mara looked at the medication shelves, organized, labeled, the ordinary infrastructure of care. She had restocked these shelves 100 times. My commendations, she said. The ones that were removed, what were they for? Hargrove looked at her steadily. The Bareva extraction, the Kellner evacuation, and a third one, Operation Duskfield, that I'm not authorized to detail in this setting. Mara remembered Duskfield. She hadn't thought about it in years because thinking about it had never been productive. It was the operation before Caldera, the one that had gone right, and that going right had been the reason she'd been selected for Caldera, and that selection had been the beginning of the sequence that ended in Denton, Washington, with a badge that said Mara Voss and a shift record that had no history before 3 years ago. Okay, she said. There's one more thing, Hargrove said. Her tone changed slightly. Not softer exactly, but different. The professional neutrality dropping a fraction. At 8 o'clock this morning, Hartfield's legal counsel contacted the IG's office and indicated that Hartfield intends to contest the review findings. He's claiming that the documentation you submitted has been fabricated and that your testimony is motivated by personal grievance. Mara had expected this. She had expected it so thoroughly that it landed without impact. The forensic analysis is solid. His counsel knows that. Hargrove held her gaze. This isn't a legal strategy. It's a delay strategy. He's trying to slow the public process long enough to, we're not sure exactly, possibly to make contact with other people, possibly to arrange something else. Something else, Mara repeated. We don't know. His communications have been monitored since last night, but he's been careful. She paused. I want you to be aware, not alarmed. Aware. Mara was aware. She was also, she realized, not frightened. She had spent 3 years being quietly frightened, not the acute fear of immediate threat, but the low constant fear of a person who has been erased and knows how easy it is to be erased again. That fear had organized her life, had determined the apartment and the minimum furniture and the envelope in the locker and the habit of watching exits. She was not frightened now. She was something else, something harder and more directed, something that she recognized as the specific mental state she had operated in during the worst situations she'd been part of, where the stakes were clear and the options were limited, and the thing to do was to be exactly where she was and do exactly what the moment required. I understand, she said. Hargrove left. Reese appeared in the doorway of the medication room approximately 90 seconds later, which told Mara he had been waiting in the corridor for Hargrove to finish. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her across the gurney the night before the tension pneumothorax, like someone doing a rapid assessment and finding the picture different than expected. The statement goes out at 9, he said. Hargrove told me what's in it. She told me too. Your name isn't in it, the initial release. No. He was quiet for a moment. The floor knows something's been happening. Bev knows more than the floor. The soldiers upstairs probably know most of it. He crossed his arms. What do you want me to tell people? It was an unexpected question. Not what should I tell people, which would have been about his own management of the situation. What do you want me to tell people, which put the decision with her? She thought about it. Tell them the truth, she said. When it's appropriate to tell it, that there was a situation that involved a member of this staff, that the appropriate authorities handled it, and that it's been resolved. She paused. Tell them the floor runs normally today. Tell them patients don't care what happened yesterday. Reese nodded slowly. For what it's worth, he said, and I know it's about 3 years too late, you're the best clinical instinct I've worked with in 15 years, including attendings, including surgeons I've worked under. He said it plainly, without the excess of apology, just as a statement of observation. I should have seen that a long time ago. She looked at him. At the 15 years of surgical training and the talent that was real and the blind spots that were also real. You saw what was in front of you, she said. Most people do. He looked slightly uncomfortable, which was probably the appropriate response. Go, she said. You have rounds. He went. The statement was released at 9:03 a.m. Mara was in Bay 2 when the hospital's administrative coordinator forwarded the IG's press release to the department heads, as they apparently did with all significant government communications related to current patients. Reese brought her a printed copy at 9:15. She read it in the break room with a cup of coffee she actually wanted for once. The language was formal and precise and careful in the way of official documents, but what it said was unambiguous. An investigation had confirmed that service records of classified military personnel had been deliberately altered without authorization, that the officer responsible had been identified, and that formal proceedings were underway. It named Hartfield. It referenced the review board. It used the word misconduct, and then, in the next sentence, it used the word criminal, which was a word that official documents used carefully and which, when they used it, tended to carry weight. She read it twice. She set it down. She finished her coffee. At 10 o'clock a.m., Martinez came to the ER floor looking for her. Mara saw her coming from the nurse's station and read her face before she reached earshot. Something had happened. Not bad, not urgent in the medical sense, but significant. Hartfield's legal counsel withdrew this morning, Martinez said, when she got close enough to speak quietly, 20 minutes after the statement went out. Mara stared at her. His lead attorney pulled their representation. They cited an ethical conflict. Martinez's expression was controlled, but something was working underneath it, which means either the attorney decided the case wasn't winnable and didn't want the exposure, or they found out something about Hartfield that they couldn't ethically continue past. Which is it? We don't know yet, but Hargrove says losing counsel at this stage is significant. It changes his options. Martinez paused. It's also going to get out. When a former brigadier general loses his legal counsel the morning after a federal statement names him in a misconduct review, that tends to get noticed. It did. By 11:30 a.m., Mara saw it in the news feed on the break room television, a text chyron at the bottom of a news broadcast, brief and factual and enough. Former military official named in federal record tampering review. Legal counsel withdrawal confirmed. The person in the break room watching the television was a second-year resident who had no idea what it meant to anyone on this floor. He looked at it briefly and looked away. Mara looked at it for longer. At 1:05 p.m., Hargrove came to find her directly. She walked onto the ER floor with Martinez and the younger officer from her team, and she had the expression of someone carrying news they'd been waiting to carry. Hartfield has retained new counsel, Hargrove said, and his new counsel's first communication to the IG's office was a request for a cooperation agreement. The room didn't change. The monitors kept their rhythm. The floor kept its ordinary noise. He's going to cooperate? Mara asked. His counsel indicated he's willing to provide testimony about the chain of authorization above him in exchange for consideration in the proceedings. Hargrove's voice was neutral. Hartfield didn't make this decision alone. He had authorization from above him. The question was always how far up the authorization went. She looked at Mara. He's apparently decided that protecting the people above him is no longer in his interest. Above him. Mara absorbed that. She had known, from the documents, that the authorization for what happened to her unit had not originated entirely with Hartfield. She had suspected. The documents had been enough to identify him as the executor. They had not been enough to identify who he'd been executing for. How far up? She asked. That's what his cooperation is going to tell us, Hargrove said. The proceedings are no longer just about what happened to your records. They're about what authorized the original operation misconduct that your records were tampered to conceal. The shape of it was larger than she had understood. 7 years ago, she had found documents in a field and brought them to her commanding officer and believed, genuinely and completely, that the process she was triggering was the one designed to handle exactly this. She had been wrong about the process, and she had paid the price of being wrong about it, and she had spent 7 years not knowing how large the thing was that she'd stumbled into. Standing in her own ER, in her stained scrubs, with Hargrove in front of her and the hospital floor running its ordinary machine around her, she finally understood the full scale of what she'd been carrying. She understood also that she had not been carrying it alone, that Warwick had been carrying a piece of it, and the 6 former unit members who'd given testimony had been carrying pieces of it, and that the weight she'd felt for 7 years had never been the full weight of the thing itself. "What happens now?" she asked. "The formal hearing is scheduled for 6 weeks from today. Congressional oversight. The cooperation agreement goes through a separate process." Hargrove looked at her steadily. "You'll be formally named in the public record when the hearing is scheduled, not before. But prepare yourself for that." "I'm prepared." Hargrove looked at her in the way she'd looked at her yesterday. The almost human look, the one that was trying to be professional and not quite managing it completely. "Your record restoration will be formally processed in the next 30 days, she said. "The commendations, the service history, all of it." She paused. "You'll be Mara Voss, ER nurse, and you'll also be, officially, in the record, who you were before." Mara looked at her. "I've been both the whole time," she said. Hargrove almost smiled. It was brief and professional, and it was there. Then her phone vibrated, and she looked at it, and the almost smile went somewhere else, replaced by the thing that had been under it the whole time. Not alarm, but the concentrated attention of someone who has just received information they weren't expecting. She looked up. "Hartfield's cooperation agreement," she said. "His new counsel just transmitted the preliminary disclosure. The names he's providing as the authorization chain above him." She looked at Mara. "One of them is currently serving. "Active military?" Mara asked. "No." Hargrove's voice was carefully flat. "Civilian position. Federal appointment." She paused 1 second. "A federal appointment that gives that individual oversight authority over the exact type of review we're currently conducting." The ER floor kept moving around them. Somewhere a monitor alarmed softly. Somewhere a resident called a medication order. The light through the ambulance bay windows was the gray November light that had been there all week. Mara stood in the middle of her floor and understood what Hargrove was telling her without Hargrove saying it plainly, because Hargrove was a careful enough person to not say it plainly in an unsecured room. The person above Hartfield had oversight authority over the review that had just produced its first significant findings, the review that was about to formally name Mara Voss in a public congressional hearing. The person above Hartfield had known about this review from the moment it was formally initiated, and had let it proceed, which meant either they believed it wouldn't reach them, that Hartfield would hold, that the documentation wouldn't be enough, that Mara Voss in a Denton hospital with her name erased from the record would stay erased, or they had let it proceed deliberately for a reason she didn't yet understand, a reason that required something from her specifically that she hadn't given yet. She looked at Hargrove. Hargrove looked back at her with the expression of a person who had just realized the same thing at the same moment and was doing the calculation at the same speed. "The on-call suite," Hargrove said. Quiet. "Can you go back there now?" "My shift." "Your shift can be covered." Hargrove's voice had the particular quality of a statement that was not open to adjustment. "I need you in a secured location while I make some calls. Right now." Mara looked at the floor around her. Rodriguez at the station, Bev moving toward triage. The ordinary machinery of a hospital day running exactly the way it was supposed to run. She had spent 3 years wanting to be nowhere else but this floor. "Okay," she said. She followed Hargrove toward the elevator. She was 3 steps from the elevator doors when her phone vibrated. Unknown number. She looked at Hargrove. Hargrove looked at her. She answered. The voice on the other end was not the voice from yesterday's call. It was not Soren. It was not anyone she had spoken to in the past 48 hours. It was a voice she had not heard in 7 years, and it belonged to the commanding officer she had reported to the morning after Caldera, the one who had looked at her documents and told her the appropriate channels were handling it, and who she had never been able to determine whether he had been complicit or deceived. "Mara," he said, "I know you're in the middle of this. I know what Hartfield is telling them. A pause. And I know they haven't told you yet why the person at the top of the chain let this review go forward. She stood in the corridor with the elevator doors in front of her and Hargrove watching her face and the hospital floor running its ordinary noise behind her. Tell me, she said. They need a witness, he said. Not for Hartfield. For what comes after Hartfield. The review isn't the end of this process, Mara. You are. Another pause, shorter this time. And the person at the top has been waiting for you to surface for 2 years. Not to bury you, to use you. The elevator arrived. The doors opened. The corridor was empty in both directions. Mara stood in it and felt the particular sensation of the ground shifting under what she'd believed she was standing on. And she kept her voice level, and she kept her face level, and she said, "Use me for what?" The voice on the other end of the phone took exactly 3 seconds to answer. 3 seconds was long enough for Mara to read several things into the silence. That the man on the other end was choosing his words carefully, that he had rehearsed some version of this conversation and was now finding that the rehearsed version didn't quite fit the reality of her tone, and that whatever he was about to say was something he had been holding for longer than this phone call. There's a second operation, her former commanding officer said. His name was Roland Vetch, and she had not spoken to him since the morning he told her the appropriate channels were handling everything, and she had spent 7 years not knowing whether he had believed that when he said it. Not Caldera. Something that ran parallel to it, that used the same authorization chain. The people above Hartfield didn't just cover up one operation. They built a system. And the review, your testimony, Warwick's documentation, it opened the door. But to go through the door, they need someone who was inside both. I wasn't inside both, she said. You were adjacent to the second one, the Kellner evacuation. A pause. The commendation they gave you for Kellner, the one they took back when they took everything else. It was for actions that put you in a position to observe things they couldn't afford to have observed. She stood in the corridor and felt the shape of something she had never fully assembled clicking into place. The Kellner evacuation. She had thought about it as a mission, a successful one, a thing she had done well and been recognized for. She had not thought about it as an observation point. She had not thought about what she had seen at Kellner that she hadn't fully registered as significant because the mission objective had consumed her attention. Until this moment, standing in a hospital corridor with Hargrove watching her face, she hadn't put it together. The secondary site, she said. Yes. The facility we passed on the approach. The one that wasn't on the operational map. Yes. Vetch's voice was quiet. It's been 7 years, Mara. Whatever you remember about that facility, what it looked like, what was moving in and out of it, what the personnel there were wearing, that's the testimony they need. Not for the Caldera case, for what comes after. She looked at Hargrove. Hargrove had the focused stillness of a person absorbing half a conversation and building the other half from context. Why are you calling me, Roland? Mara asked. Why now? Why you? Another pause, this one longer. Because I owe you that much, he said. I believed them when they told me the process was handling it. I want you to know that. I know it doesn't change what happened to you. But I believed them, and by the time I understood I'd been wrong, the architecture of what they'd built was larger than I knew how to address from where I was standing. His voice had something in it that she hadn't heard there 7 years ago. Something worn. I've been talking to the IG's office for 4 months. My testimony is part of what gave Warwick's documentation enough context to be submitted. She hadn't known that. You should have called me, she said. I know. 4 months ago, a year ago. You should have called me. I know that too. He didn't try to explain further. Some things didn't have explanations that were worth the air they took up. She looked at the elevator doors, at the ordinary hospital corridor, at Hargrove, who was now on her own phone, speaking quietly. Her expression shifted into something with more urgency than it had carried 60 seconds ago. I'll give testimony about Kellner, Mara said. Whatever I remember, however useful it is. It'll be useful, Vetch said. I promise you that. Don't promise me things, she said. Just be in the right room when it matters. She ended the call. Hargrove finished her own call 10 seconds later. She looked at Mara with the expression of someone who had just received information that reorganized the landscape. The second authorization chain, Mara said. You already knew about it. We had a strong hypothesis, Hargrove said. We've been looking for the connective tissue for 6 months. The Kellner site was one of the threads we couldn't fully pull. She looked at Mara steadily. Can you describe it? Yes, Mara said. Give me a room and a recorder, and I'll describe everything I saw. They went upstairs. What? The second testimony session lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes and was attended by 3 JAG officers, a representative from a Federal Intelligence Oversight Office, whose specific designation Hargrove didn't detail, and a senior IG investigator who joined by secure video link from Washington. Mara described the Kellner approach in the specific sensory detail that field training embedded in your memory, whether you wanted it there or not. The terrain, the light conditions, the distance, the facility's layout as she'd observed it from the extraction route, the personnel she'd seen and what their clothing and positioning suggested about their function. She described it all without being certain, in real time, how much of it mattered. That was the nature of this kind of testimony. You gave what you had and let the people with the larger picture determine where your piece fit. She had learned, over the course of the past 48 hours, that her piece was larger than she'd understood. That the thing she'd stumbled into 7 years ago, in a field in a country she still couldn't name to most people, had been substantial enough that powerful people had spent 7 years and significant resources making sure it stayed buried, and that it had taken exactly 1 military helicopter going down in the hills east of Denton, Washington, to start pulling it back into the light. When she finished, the IG investigator on the video link said, "The facility you've described matches signals intelligence from that period that we've been unable to contextualize. Your observation of the personnel configuration specifically, that resolves a significant gap." He paused. "This is the piece we needed to move forward on the secondary authorization chain." Mara nodded. She was very tired. Hargrove walked her out of the session room and down the corridor toward the on-call suite, and partway there, she stopped and looked at Mara with the kind of directness that Mara had come to understand was Hargrove's version of warmth. "Go rest," she said. "Actual rest. The next phase of this is going to take weeks, and you need to be functional for it." What happens to the person at the top of the chain? When the Kellner testimony is processed, and the secondary authorization chain is documented, and that's going to happen faster than the first chain because we have significantly more infrastructure in place now. The proceedings extend to include them. Hargrove's voice was level. They let this review go forward because they believed Hartfield would hold, and your testimony would either be unavailable or insufficient. They miscalculated on both counts. And now they're in the review. Hargrove confirmed, with considerably less room to maneuver than they had this time yesterday. Mara looked at the corridor, at the plain institutional walls, at the light fixtures doing their ordinary work. "Do you know why I became a medic?" she asked. Hargrove waited. "Not a nurse. I was a medic first, in the unit. I chose it specifically." She wasn't sure why she was saying this, except that she'd been saying important things to strangers for 2 days, and this seemed like the moment to say one more. Because medics are the people nobody thinks about until the thing goes wrong, and then they're the only people anyone is thinking about. She paused. "I liked being the person who showed up when everything had already gone wrong. I was good at it." "You're still good at it," Hargrove said. "I know." She said it without vanity. It was just true. "I spent 3 years pretending I was something less than that, because it felt safer. And because when you've had everything taken once, you start believing the way to protect what you rebuild is to make it small enough that nobody notices it." Hargrove looked at her. "And now?" Mara thought about Tally in his hospital gown in the conference room doorway, about Bev Okafor calling security without being asked, about Rodriguez saying that's the job and meaning it as a complete answer, about Reese across a gurney in the worst moment of the shift, making the right call when it mattered. "Now I think making yourself small doesn't protect you," she said. "It just means when they come for you, there's less of you left to fight back with." Hargrove was quiet for a moment. "Get some sleep, Nurse Voss," she said. Mara got some sleep. The congressional hearing convened 5 weeks and 3 days after the night the helicopter went down. In those 5 weeks, several things happened in sequence, each one building on the one before it in the way that institutional accountability built. Slowly, then suddenly, with the particular irreversibility of a process that had accumulated enough weight to carry itself forward without anyone being able to stop it. Victor Hartfield's cooperation agreement was formalized in the second week. His testimony named 4 individuals above him in the authorization chain, one of whom was the currently serving federal appointee Hargrove had referenced. That individual, a man named Warren Price Holloway, deputy director of a federal oversight office, 61 years old, who had spent 11 years in a position that gave him the ability to shape which investigations went forward and which ones quietly stalled, retained 3 separate legal teams in the space of 4 days, and attempted to invoke a classification privilege that the IG's office spent 6 days successfully contesting. The classification privilege argument failed. The 3rd week brought a formal Senate committee notification. The 4th week brought the public announcement of the hearing. Mara's name appeared in that announcement in a single sentence, identifying her as a primary witness, and that sentence was picked up by a wire service and distributed to 14 news outlets before the end of the day. She was in the ER when Bev sent her the link. She read it at the nurse's station. 1 sentence. Her name, her former role in the classified unit referenced as a military medical specialist, the words primary witness. She had known it was coming. She had spent 4 weeks knowing it was coming. It still landed differently than she'd expected. Not worse, not better, just different, the way things always landed differently than the anticipation of them. Rodriguez appeared beside her. "That's you," he said, looking at the screen over her shoulder. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said. Then he went back to his chart. She appreciated that more than she knew how to say. Dr. Reese found her an hour later and did not say anything about the announcement at all. He said, "Tally's discharges this afternoon. He wants to see you before he goes." She went to the 3rd floor. Private Owen Tally was dressed in civilian clothes for the first time since she'd seen him. Jeans, a gray sweatshirt, the particular relief of a young person whose body has been returned to them after a week of institutional management. He had more color than he'd had in Bay 1. He looked fundamentally like a person who was going to be fine. He stood up when she came through the door, which was a gesture that surprised her. "You don't have to," she started. "I know." He stayed standing. "I saw the announcement." She sat in the chair beside the bed because one of them should be sitting. "It'll be a public record soon, the whole story. You'll be able to read it." "I don't need to read it." He looked at her directly. "I know enough. I know what you did in that bay, and I know they tried to erase the person who did it, and I know that's wrong in a way that doesn't need a congressional hearing to confirm." He paused. "I gave a statement to the JAG officer last week, on the record, about what happened in Bay 1. They said it would be part of the hearing materials." She hadn't known that. "Owen, I know it's small," he said. "I know it's not the same as the big testimony, but I wanted something on record that said just that you were there and you were good at it, and it mattered." He looked at his shoes for a moment, then back at her. "From someone who was in the room." She looked at him. 23 years old, from Idaho, going home with functioning lungs because of 45 seconds and a needle, and the specific knowledge of what a deviated trachea looked like. "Thank you," she said. This time she meant it the way she'd stopped herself from meaning things for 3 years. Fully, without the protective layer. He nodded. He was 23 and trying to contain an emotion that was too big for the room and doing a reasonable job of it. She stood and held out her hand and he shook it, firmly, and she left before either of them could make it worse by saying more. The hearing was held in Washington in a Senate committee room that Mara had never been in but recognized from news photographs. The curved mahogany dais, the nameplate cards, the particular arrangement of cameras and staff, and the dense, charged atmosphere of a room where official things were happening and the officialness of them was the point. She wore civilian clothes. She had considered this more carefully than she had considered most things in the past month. Not for vanity, but because the clothes you wore to a thing like this communicated something, and she wanted to communicate accurately. She wore a dark jacket over a gray shirt, and she looked like what she was, a woman in her early 40s who had done difficult work in difficult places and had come to a room full of cameras to say so clearly and on the record. Warwick was there, to her left, in uniform. He had been discharged from Harlow Memorial 10 days after the night he arrived, the shoulder repaired, the flank wound healed to the satisfaction of the surgical team. He looked better than he'd looked in room 312. He also looked, she thought, older in a way that wasn't physical. The look of someone who had been carrying something for a long time and was finally in the room where he could set it down. Vetch was there too, 3 seats down. He had aged more than Warwick. He did not look at her when she sat down, and then, after a moment, he did look at her, and she held his gaze for 3 seconds, long enough to say something that didn't have words, and then she looked at the dais. The committee chair called the hearing to order at 9 a.m. Mara gave her testimony third, after the IG's lead investigator and after Warwick. She had prepared what she was going to say, had gone over it with the JAG team's legal advisors twice, had written and rewritten the opening statement until it said what she meant without saying more than she meant. What she said, when the chair called her name and the room went to the particular attention of a room that understood something significant was about to be spoken, was this. She described what she had witnessed. She described what she had reported. She described what had happened to her after she reported it, in the specific procedural language of someone who understood that the procedural language was the part that mattered, not the experience of it, which was also real, but the mechanism of it, which was what the committee needed to understand in order to address it. She described the Kellner facility. She described Caldera. She described the morning her access was revoked, and the call from the JAG officer who was implementing an administrative review that didn't exist, and she described Denton, Washington, and 3 years of wearing a badge with her name on it and being told by the room around her that she was ordinary. She said, "I am not here today to ask for sympathy. I'm here because the process that was used to silence me is a process that could be used on anyone who finds themselves in possession of information that inconveniences powerful people. The specific mechanism, the record modification, the administrative review as a delay and discrediting tool, doesn't require extraordinary resources. It requires access and the willingness to use it. The question this committee needs to answer is not just what happened to me, it's how to make what happened to me structurally impossible." She stopped speaking. The room was quiet. The committee chair said, "Thank you, Nurse Voss." Price Holloway testified in the afternoon session, under subpoena, with his legal team seated behind him. He was 61, and looked it in the specific way of people who had spent decades in rooms like this, and understood that the rooms had rules, and that the rules had usually protected them. He answered questions carefully and briefly, and in the particular register of someone who had been advised to say as little as possible while technically complying with the requirement to say something. It didn't help him. The documentation was there. Warwick's materials, Mara's drive, Vetch's internal communications, the forensic analysis, the signals intelligence from Kellner that Mara's description had finally contextualized. All of it assembled into a record that Price Holloway's careful brevity couldn't reach or revise. The committee had read the record before the hearing. The hearing wasn't where the case was being made. The case had already been made. The hearing was where it was being stated in public, on record, with cameras present, in a room that existed specifically for the purpose of making things official. At 4:15 p.m., the committee chair made a statement on behalf of the committee. Mara sat in the witness gallery and listened to the chair use words like deliberate obstruction and systematic record tampering and abuse of institutional authority in the flat, formal cadence of official language, and she watched Warren Price Holloway at the witness table receive each word with the stillness of a man who understood that the stillness was the only thing left available to him. Hartfield wasn't in the room. I was in a separate legal process, his cooperation agreement in active implementation, his future being negotiated in a different set of rooms. The two officials below Price Holloway in the chain were facing charges that had been detailed in committee materials released that morning. The third contractor, the one who had been in Warwick's hospital room, had entered a plea agreement. The architecture that had buried 12 people 7 years ago was being taken apart piece by piece, and the taking apart was happening in public, with cameras, with a public record that would be accessible to anyone who wanted to find it, which meant it couldn't be quietly removed from the record later, which meant it was real in the permanent way that official public things were real. Mara sat in the witness gallery and felt the weight of that. Not triumph. She had been careful these past weeks not to organize herself around triumph, because triumph was about winning and she hadn't been in a competition. She'd been in a situation. The situation was resolving. Those were different things. What she felt was something closer to completion, the specific sensation of a thing that has been unfinished for a very long time being, at last, finished. Warwick found her in the corridor outside the committee room afterward, in the press of people moving in various directions, staff, attorneys, journalists, committee members' aides. He looked the way she felt, tired, resolved, a person at the end of something rather than the beginning. "How are you doing?" he asked. "Ask me in a week," she said, "when I'm back in Denton." He looked at her. "You're going back." "That's my floor," she said. "Those are my patients." She paused. "I'm also going back to something else. Hargrove's team reached out last week about a consulting role. Training. How to recognize field-acquired medical instincts in civilian healthcare contexts. How to advocate for personnel who've been removed through the kind of process that was used on our unit." "You said yes?" "I said I'd think about it." She looked at him. "I think I'm going to say yes." He nodded slowly. He had the look of a man who wanted to say several things and was choosing between them. "For what it's worth," he said, "watching you in that room today, you weren't the person they erased. You were the person they couldn't erase." He said it plainly, without the excess weight of someone trying to land a line. Just a statement of observation. She looked at him. At the older face, the worn quality that came from 2 years of building toward this. "Neither were you," she said. They stood in the corridor for a moment, two people at the end of a 7-year accumulation of wrong things finally being put right, in a government building corridor with people moving around them and cameras outside and a public record that now existed and couldn't be taken back. It wasn't a clean ending. Nothing was a clean ending. Price Holloway's legal process would take months. The hearings for the others in the chain were pending. The 12 records being restored were at various stages of the restoration process. The structural reforms the committee had recommended were in the early stages of being drafted. None of it was finished. But it was in motion. And it was in motion because a military helicopter had gone down in the hills east of Denton, and a man with fragment wounds had opened his eyes in a trauma bay and looked past every doctor in the room, and a woman with a coffee stain on her scrubs, and 3 years of careful silence had looked back at him and decided that silence had its limits. She was back on the ER floor at Harlow Memorial 7 days later. The first shift back had the quality of a return that is also, in some way, a beginning. The same floor, the same lights, the same smell of disinfectant and bad coffee. But the person walking through the doors was not the person who had walked through them 3 weeks ago. Because 3 weeks ago, that person had been carrying something she wasn't carrying anymore. Bev Okafor was at the nurse's station. "Welcome back," Bev said, without looking up from her screen, and then she looked up. "You look different." "Same as always," Mara said. "No." Bev looked at her with 11 years of knowing what people looked like on her floor. "You don't." She didn't argue. Rodriguez handed her a chart. "Bay 2, he said. "Chest pain, 64-year-old male, came in 30 minutes ago. EKG's been read, but the resident's waiting on you." She took the chart. She went to Bay 2. The patient was a man named Gerald, who had driven himself to the hospital because he hadn't wanted to bother his wife. A decision that Mara understood and found gently infuriating in the way she found it every time, which was often. His chest pain had an atypical presentation, not the textbook version, the one people knew from television, but the real version, which was frequently described as indigestion or fatigue or a vague pressure that didn't seem serious enough to warrant the word emergency. She assessed him carefully. She asked him questions. She listened to the answers and to the things underneath the answers. The slight shortness of breath he mentioned as an afterthought. The way he'd been more tired than usual for the past 2 days. The detail about his father and his uncle both having cardiac histories that he included apologetically, as though it were an inconvenience. She ordered the troponin and the repeat EKG and the cardiology consult, and she sat beside the bed for a moment while the blood was being drawn, and she said, "Gerald, you did the right thing by coming in." He looked at her with the eyes of a man who had been hoping someone would tell him that. "My wife's going to say I should have called her." "She's right," Mara said. "But you're here. That's what matters now." The troponin came back elevated. Gerald was going to cardiology. Gerald was going to be fine because he had driven himself to a hospital at 8 in the morning instead of waiting to see if the pressure in his chest resolved on its own. Mara walked him to the cardiology unit herself. She came back to the ER floor and moved through the rest of the shift with the specific quality of attention she'd had for 3 years. Precise, thorough, the kind of presence that made the floor work better without anyone being able to point to a specific thing she'd done and call it notable. The invisible labor, the work in the gaps, except it wasn't invisible anymore. Not in the way it had been. The staff knew more of it now. Not all of it, not the classified particulars, but the shape of it. That Mara Voss had a history that her scrubs and her shift record hadn't reflected. That the instincts they'd been benefiting from for 3 years came from somewhere real and significant, and that had been deliberately obscured. Reese found her at the end of the shift, in the break room, at the same window where she'd stood 3 weeks ago and watched the weather building over the eastern hills. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. He sat down at the break room table, which was unusual. He didn't often sit in the break room. It was a room for nurses and residents, not for the trauma surgery attending who had an office. "The hospital has been talking about formalizing a role, training, and protocol development. The mass casualty response that night. The post-incident review flagged several gaps. Things that would have been caught faster if there'd been someone with a field medicine background embedded in the protocol design." She looked at him. "It would be in addition to your current role," he said, "not instead of it. And it wouldn't be my decision. It goes through administration, but I'd be advocating for it." He paused. "I wanted to tell you that directly." She thought about Hargrove's consulting offer, about the JAG team's request for training input on field-to-civilian medical transition, about Talley's statement entered into the record and the 12 records being restored and the structural reforms the committee was drafting. The world didn't change all at once. It changed in the accumulation of small structural things that added up to something different over time. She understood that, had always understood it. "Tell administration I'm interested," she said. He nodded. He started to stand, and then he didn't immediately stand, and she recognized the hesitation of a person who has one more thing to say and is deciding whether to say it. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've been thinking about what you said, that most people see what's in front of them." He looked at her directly. "I'm trying to be better at looking past the front of things." She held his gaze. "That's the work," she said. He left. She sat at the break room window. The hills east of Denton were clear today. The November weather had broken into something sharper and colder, and the sky above the tree line was the particular blue of late autumn that only appeared for a few weeks before the gray settled in for the season. She could see the ridge clearly, the one she'd watched from this window for 3 years, the one she'd stood at and felt the weather changing the night the helicopter had come down. She thought about the 12 people whose records were being restored, in various stages, at various speeds, some of them willing to be found and some of them not yet, some of them in places like Denton, and some of them in places she'd never know about. She thought about what it was to build a life inside an erasure, and what it took to begin building something different when the erasure was reversed. She knew something about that. She was in the middle of learning it. She thought about what she would have told herself if she could have gone back to the first week in Denton, to the woman who had rented a minimally furnished apartment and kept an envelope in a hospital locker and made herself small because small felt safer than visible. She would have told her, it was never the visibility that was dangerous, it was the isolation. The visibility was always the way out. She would have told her, the people who tried to erase you counted on you believing you were gone. The moment you stop believing that, they lose. She would have told her, you are going to be a nurse in a hospital in Denton, Washington, and it is going to be real work and it is going to matter. And one night a man you thought you'd never see again is going to come through the doors, and everything that has been waiting is going to start moving. Don't make yourself so small that you can't move when it does. She didn't know if her past self would have believed any of it. She believed it now. The break room was empty. The floor was running its evening machinery outside the door. Someone would need something in about 4 minutes. She could feel the particular rhythm of the floor, had felt it for 3 years, knew its cadences the way you knew the cadences of any place you'd spent enough time in. She stood up. She straightened her scrubs. She went back to work. Not because she had to, not because there was nowhere else to go, or because she was hiding, or because the thing she'd built here was small enough to be safe. She went back because the work was real, and she was good at it, and the people on the other side of that door needed someone who showed up fully, not a version of herself that had been made small by fear or silence or the long accumulated weight of being told she didn't belong in the room. She belonged in the room. She had always belonged in the room. The door opened, and Mara Voss walked through it. The woman they'd tried to erase, the woman who had carried her own evidence for 7 years in an envelope in a locker, the woman whose name was now on a congressional record and a restoration order and a commendation that was being reinstated and a hospital floor that had run better for 3 years because she was on it. And she went to the nurse's station and picked up the next chart and went to the next patient and did what she had always done. She showed up. That was the whole of it, in the end. Not the heroics, not the classified call sign, not the testimony or the hearing or the public record. All of that mattered, and all of that was real, and none of it was the thing itself. The thing itself was simpler and harder than all of it combined. To keep showing up, fully, as the complete version of yourself, in a world that spent considerable energy trying to convince you that a smaller version was safer. It wasn't. The small version was just easier to lose. Mara Voss was not interested in being easy to lose. She had tried it for 3 years, and she was done.